The strongest muscle. Every ultra runner knows what it's like to push through discomfort. We know sore legs. We know blisters. We know climbing another hill when every part of us wants to stop. But there's one muscle we often forget to thank. The one that's been working every second since before we were born. Your heart. It doesn't ask for applause. It doesn't ask for recognition. It simply keeps showing up, beat after beat, day after day, year after year. As runners, we celebrate mileage, personal records, race medals, the finish lines. But maybe the greatest accomplishment isn't crossing another finish line. Maybe it's making sure your heart is healthy enough to cross thousands more. Real strength isn't ignoring warning signs. Real courage isn't pretending you're invincible. Real wisdom is knowing when to train hard and when to recover even harder. The strongest athletes don't just chase fitness. They protect it, they respect it, they invest in it. That means fueling your body with real food, sleeping enough to recover, taking rest days without guilt, listening when your body whispers before it has to scream. Because your goal shouldn't simply be to finish your next ultra marathon. Your goal should be to hike with your grandchildren, to lift your suitcase into the overhead bin when you're 80, to wake up excited for another sunrise, to keep running because you still can. Every easy run, every healthy meal, every good night's sleep, every decision to recover, you're making a deposit into your future. Your heart is carrying you through every mile. The question is, are you taking care of the heart that's taking care of you? Run with passion, train with purpose, recover with intent. Protect your heart, because the greatest endurance event you'll ever run is your life. And that's one race worth finishing strong. Welcome into Running Miles. I'm your host and coach, Josh. Thanks for being here with me today. Just wanted to say thanks for listening to this podcast. I know there's a lot out there, whether there's other podcasters or audiobooks that you could be listening to. So thanks again for listening. And if you want to follow, that would be great. Then I could actually maybe one day get paid for this. So if you follow it, that would be great. Also, if you follow, then you get the latest podcasts that I upload, usually weekly. I've been trying to do Saturdays at 3 a.m., thinking of the crowd that I'm doing the podcast for. Usually, you might be going out at 4, so that way it gives you plenty of time to download it on your device before you leave the house if you don't have Wi-Fi when you're outdoors. So, but anyways, so the latest episode is supposed to come at 3 a.m. on a Saturday, but sometimes for whatever reason, Audible kind of messed up a couple of weeks where it didn't release it until like the next day. So I don't know what that was about. But anyways, for the most part, it does release at 3 a.m. So, yeah. But thanks for being here. And hopefully this episode will help you understand more about your heart. And, with me, my non-negotiables are just working out 30 minutes a day. That just seems to be the best return on investment. Obviously, you could go to 40 minutes or 45 minutes, and then it kind of plateaus. It doesn't get much benefit after that, which a lot of research has been, maybe 20 minutes to 45 minutes. So I kind of do in the middle. But that's just me. You do your own thing. And then I try to limit myself to 1 ultra a year. Just because I am worried about getting inflammation in the heart. So that's just what I do. But if I keep learning, maybe I can change. I don't know. Also, it gives me plenty of time to recover and to learn more, because when you're doing a lot of ultra events, you're running a lot. Obviously, you could listen to the podcasts, the audiobooks, which you would, I guess, get education from. But sometimes after those runs, you get so tired that there's not much you want to do after those runs. So yes, it does up like a zombie after running 30 miles or 35 miles, or even a marathon, 26. So yeah, so it's good to take a break. But that's what I do. You guys could do your own thing. Not saying my way's right, your way's wrong. Just saying that's what I do. If you like running all the time, then I guess keep going. But just the thought that we can just eat anything we want and never have a consequence, that's been debunked plenty of times. So just make sure you're eating whole foods. I don't care what lifestyle you're doing, but whole foods are the way if you can. Although it is tough to get those carbohydrates in the long runs when they say to have like 120. I guess with myself, I took in a lot of sugar to get those carbs. But I think I'd do it different next time I start training for 100 miler. So anyways, let me go ahead and read you a story about a runner. So I was thinking the other day, ultrarunners have really strange relationships with their hearts. Normal people hear their hearts pounding and think, I should probably sit down. Ultrarunners hear their heart pounding and think, sweet, my watch finally found my circadians. We are in a weird group. We voluntarily wake up at 4 in the morning to run 50 miles and somehow convince ourselves this is recovery. Then somebody asks, how was your weekend? And we're like, pretty relaxing. I only climbed the equivalent of the entire state building 4 times. The funny part is how we talk to our hearts. Mile 5, you've got this, buddy. Mile 25, come on, don't quit now. Mile 40, listen, we're in this together. Mile 60, okay, this whole thing was your idea. And then your watch battery starts beeping. Low battery. Excuse me, I'm the one hallucinating squirrels wearing race bibs and you're worried about your battery? Then your heart chimes in. Actually, I'd like to file a complaint too. By the finish line, you've promised your heart everything. I swear, we'll take a month off. More vegetables, more sleep, less caffeine. Absolutely, no more 100 milers. Then registration opens Monday. You click register. Your heart doesn't even get mad anymore. It just sighs. Well, at least buy me some salmon this time. All right, just wanted to update with my running. I've been going on vacation and it's tough out there when you're not eating at home and you're with your partner, wife. So she likes to eat out and I do too, I guess. But it's just tough to find something sometimes out there. Anyways, been a little off track with the 150 grams of protein, and I might stop that. I haven't been doing it lately after I got off of that, and I don't know. I didn't see that much benefit with the 150 grams of protein. With me, I guess my issue was, I can't get the protein from the cottage cheese, and I'm not getting the protein from the Greek yogurt, and I'm not getting the protein from a protein shake. So it was just a lot of chicken. So I've probably gone back down to 100, but I think when I start training, I'll probably do the 150 grams of protein. So help my body recover. I think that's it. But there was just a lot of food, I think, to eat. Anyhow, I think that if I do a cup of Greek yogurt, I can't breathe when I'm running. But if I do 1/4 of a cup of Greek yogurt, then it seems to be everything to be okay. So that's what I've been doing in my mix bowl. If you ask, a mix bowl, I just have, a bunch of whole foods, maybe like 25 different whole foods in a bowl. Anyways, if you don't put the Greek yogurt in there, it tastes pretty nasty. Which I have done it dry before. And I've tried peanut butter, which is pretty gross. I guess I could try olive oil. But, yeah, with the mixed bowl, it's pretty crazy. It is a lot of food. So, yeah, I think I have to continue with some kind of dressing or something. So, anyways, the Greek yogurt, if I just do 1/4 of a cup, seems to be doing okay for me, which is always strange. And I don't know if you guys want to know about this or not, but yeah, just something that I found out about 2 weeks ago when I was playing around with it. I'm noticing that if I went up to a 1/2 cup, that I was having breathing issues. But if I go down to 1/4 of a cup, it's not so bad of a problem. So kind of strange, but but that's just my body. Hopefully you guys don't have any issues and you're able to eat dairy all the time and there's not an issue. So but unfortunately that's how my body works with the dairy stuff. So I just have to be mindful of that and do what it says, I guess. Anyhow, on top of that, I still think that the beet powder and cinnamon does help me run or breathe better when I'm running. So that's always helpful information. And I've been going through lots of shoes, trying them on. It seems like the only shoe my feet really like is the Glislins from the Brooks. So kind of bought a couple of pairs of those and using those. They're a 10 millimeter drop, so that's always good for my Achilles. So yeah, and the race that I plan on racing this year is going to be all road miles. It's not going to be on a trail. So a little cushion might be helpful for the road. But I do plan on switching out some shoes and trying different shoes. But I don't think I'll go to a 0 drop again. That was pretty stupid with my Achilles injury. So yeah, probably won't do that again. And go with a higher drop and then do maybe some lower drops during the week just to walk around in, but maybe training purposes stick to the one shoe. And anyways, I'll talk more about the schedule when I actually sign up for the race, and then I'll do a series on that 100-miler, because I think I'd do the whole thing a little different than I did the last one I did. So, anywhere from sleeping. I plan on sleeping this time. Last year I was kind of afraid to sleep, so I think that would be beneficial, because the hardest part of the 100-miler for me was not sleeping, because if you have this heart condition, you know that you're always tired, but you're even more tired if you haven't slept, when you're supposed to sleep. So that was definitely pretty hard. So anyways, so hopefully you guys like this episode, and hopefully it helps you understand your heart a little bit more. And I'm going to put in the show notes 10 whole foods that can help with inflammation in the heart, and some exercises you can do to help the inflammation, and just habits that can help with inflammation. And I'll put that in the show notes, and you can always check that out. All right, I'm going to play the episode, and
you cross the finish line of an ultra marathon, and the adrenaline that has been carrying you for the last, 10 hours, it just begins to evaporate.
Yeah, and almost immediately that reality sets in.
Exactly. You know the exact feeling. It's that deep, lingering, just heavy ache in your quads and your calves.
Oh, yeah. The next morning is always brutal.
Right. Just swinging your legs over the side of the bed is an absolute ordeal. Your skeletal muscles are just screaming at you, demanding all of your attention, your foam rollers, your massage guns.
All the tools.
But, and this is the crazy part, if a doctor were to draw your blood right in that exact moment, like the morning after the race, and look at the biomarkers floating around in your bloodstream, they wouldn't just see tired legs.
No, they absolutely would not.
If they didn't know you had just run 50 miles, they would look at your lab results, totally panic, and probably immediately prep you for a massive heart attack.
It's really one of the most incredible paradoxes in human physiology, because the heart muscle, the myocardium, it doesn't possess the same localized pain receptors as your hamstrings.
Right, you can't feel it.
Exactly. You are never going to feel delayed onset muscle soreness in your left ventricle. It just doesn't happen.
Thank goodness for that, honestly.
Right. But the chemical stress signals that are circulating in your blood, they tell a story of profound, almost, violent cardiovascular trauma.
Which is exactly why we are diving so deeply into this today. Because, we all accept, fundamentally, that regular exercise is the ultimate medicine, right?
Oh, undeniably. It is the gold standard for metabolic health, for extending human lifespan.
Yeah. But there is this lingering shadow in the sports cardiology world, this thing called the extreme exercise hypothesis.
Yes, the idea that there's a limit.
Right. It proposes that when you ask your cardiovascular system to operate at maximum capacity for, 5, 10, or 15 hours at a time, you aren't just building a stronger engine.
You might actually be causing hidden damage.
Exactly. Cumulative and potentially lethal damage to the heart itself.
And that tension, that exact debate, is what makes this area of study so vital right now. We are constantly trying to locate this precise physiological border.
The border between getting fitter and getting hurt.
Yeah. Between healthy adaptation, where your heart just becomes a more efficient, powerful pump, and pathological maladaptation, where you are, silently accumulating scar tissue and electrical instability.
And to find that border today, we are stripping away the generic advice. We are diving into a massive stack of high-quality human research, systematic reviews, and the freshly published 2025 and 2026 Sports Cardiology Guidelines.
The newest data available.
Right. Our mission for this deep dive is to decode the exact mechanics of heart inflammation, figure out how to separate like a benign physiological quirk from a genuine medical crisis.
Because the line is thinner than people think.
It really is. And ultimately, we're going to break down the strict evidence-based nutritional protocols that actually protect the heart.
And, the goal here isn't to scare anyone away from endurance sports.
No, not at all. Keep running.
Please keep running. The goal is to understand the language your heart is speaking. We need to look at the why and the how behind the physical remodeling of the heart.
So that you can actually navigate your training and, probably more importantly, your recovery with actual scientific clarity.
Exactly.
I want to start with the sheer physics of what happens to the human engine under that kind of extreme stress. Because, before we can even begin to talk about inflammation or cellular damage, we really have to grasp the mechanical load.
The raw plumbing of it all.
Right. If I'm just sitting here on the couch, my resting heart is pumping roughly, 5 liters of blood every minute?
Give or take, yeah. About 5 liters.
But when an elite endurance athlete hits their peak exertion, that output doesn't just double or triple, it skyrockets to over 30 liters of blood per minute.
Stop and visualize that volume for a second because it's staggering. 30 liters is nearly 8 gallons of fluid being forced through a closed biological plumbing system.
Every 60 seconds.
Every 60 seconds. And in an ultra marathon, that relentless, 6-fold increase is sustained not for minutes, but for hours on end.
Which is just mind-blowing.
It is. And to survive that chronic volume and pressure overload, the heart has absolutely no choice but to structurally remodel itself. It literally builds a bigger, more capacious pump.
And this is the physiological phenomenon we call the athlete's heart, right?
Yes, exactly.
The walls of the heart get thicker and the internal chambers physically stretch out so they can hold more blood. You generally see a 10 to 20% increase in overall ventricular size and mass.
Which sounds great on paper.
It does. It sounds like a total physiological upgrade. But the research points out a glaring flaw in this design. Not all parts of the heart are built to handle this upgrade equally.
That's the crux of the issue. The human heart is a dual pump system. You have the left ventricle, or LV.
The big guy.
Right, the massive, thick-walled, muscular powerhouse. Its job is to forcefully eject blood out to the entire body, to your brain, your toes, your digestive tract.
It has to push hard.
Exactly. It's built to push against high systemic resistance. But then you have the right ventricle, the RV.
And the RV is just pumping blood next door to the lungs, right? Just to get it oxygenated.
Yes. The pulmonary circuit is a very low pressure system compared to the rest of the body.
Yeah.
Because it normally only has to push blood a very short distance into the spongy tissue of the lungs.
So it doesn't need to be as strong.
Right. It evolved with a much thinner wall. It simply doesn't have the sheer muscle mass of the left ventricle. And this structural difference becomes the heart's absolute Achilles heel during extreme endurance events.
Because during a massive aerobic effort, you're breathing heavily, your lungs are expanding rapidly, and the pulmonary vascular resistance just goes up.
It goes through the roof. The actual physical pressure the right ventricle has to push against to get blood into those lungs becomes immense.
Wow.
The thick-walled left ventricle, it handles the increased pressure of exercise with relative ease. But that thin-walled right ventricle is suddenly forced to operate against a massive surge in pulmonary resistance for hours.
It's just highly susceptible to this specific type of sustained pressure overload.
Highly susceptible.
I always picture the right ventricle like the standard factory issue transmission in a commuter car.
Okay, I like that.
Like for everyday driving to the grocery store, it's perfect. But if you suddenly drop that transmission into a Formula One race car and just keep the RPMs redlined for 6 hours straight, it's going to struggle. It's just not engineered for that environment.
That analogy perfectly aligns with the clinical findings. Particularly, there's a landmark study conducted by Dr. André Lagersh.
Oh, the echocardiogram study.
Yes. His team used echocardiograms to study the hearts of athletes literally right after they crossed the finish line of ultramarathons and Ironman triathlons.
Sweaty athletes getting ultrasounds in the medical tent.
Exactly. And what they found was really striking. Post-race, the right ventricle acutely dilates. It physically stretches out, ballooning under the pressure.
Ow.
And it temporarily loses a significant portion of its systolic function, meaning its ability to forcefully contract is blunted.
And meanwhile, the left ventricle is totally fine.
Essentially, yes. The left ventricle's function remains largely preserved, or maybe only minimally impacted, but the right ventricle is visibly struggling.
And we know it's struggling not just from the pictures, but because of the chemical alarm bells it starts ringing, right?
Right. Alongside that physical stretching, the researchers observed a massive spike in a biomarker called B-type natriuretic peptide, or BNP.
Okay, let's break down BNP for the listener. Why does the heart release it?
BNP is a hormone that's secreted directly by the heart muscle cells, the cardiomyocytes, specifically when they are being excessively stretched.
So it's a stretch sensor.
Basically. When the sheer volume of blood overdistends the walls of the right ventricle, The cells release BNP as a biological distress signal. Its primary job is to tell the kidneys to excrete sodium and water.
To pee it out.
Yes, it's the body's desperate attempt to lower the total blood volume and take some of the pressure off the heart.
So, the RV stretches, and it releases BNP to try and drain some fluid from the system. But here's my fundamental pushback on this whole concept.
Let's hear it.
The human body is the ultimate adaptation machine. If I lift heavy weights, my biceps tear, and then they grow back thicker and stronger. If the right ventricle is the weak link, why doesn't it just adapt over time?
That's the logical assumption.
Like, why doesn't an ultramarathoner's right ventricle eventually just thicken up to match the left ventricle?
And to a certain degree, that adaptation does happen. Lejeur's study noted that in the vast majority of athletes, the right ventricle recovers completely.
Okay, that's good news.
Yeah, within about a week of the race, it shrinks back to its normal size, its contraction strength returns to baseline, and it does structurally reinforce itself to handle the stimulus a bit better the next time. It is a very resilient piece of tissue.
But there's a catch, isn't there?
A very significant catch. The right ventricle is constrained by its inherent geometry. It can only thicken so much before it loses the flexibility it needs to function.
Oh, because it still needs to be pliable to fill with blood.
Exactly. And in the study, when they looked at the most veteran athletes, the ones who had been competing in extreme endurance sports, the longest, they found that about 13% of them had permanent scarring.
Wow.
Yeah, fibrosis in their right ventricle.
13%. I mean, that is not a trivial number.
Not at all. It strongly suggests that while the RV desperately tries to adapt to decades of extreme use, there is an absolute threshold.
A breaking point.
Right. At a certain point, the sustained pressure overload simply outpaces the delicate tissue's ability to repair itself cleanly. Instead of building healthy new muscle, the heart patches the microscopic tears with rigid scar tissue.
Okay, so if the physical stretching of the right ventricle is the mechanical mechanism of injury, how else does the body broadcast that this damage is occurring?
Well, there's another marker.
Right, we talked about BNP signaling volume overload, but there's a much more famous or maybe infamous biomarker that gets released.
Yeah.
And it's the exact same chemical that terrified our hypothetical emergency room doctor at the start of the deep dive.
Yes, we are officially talking about the troponin mystery.
Let's get into it.
In general medical practice, cardiac-specific troponins, specifically the subtypes CTNI and CTNT, they are the ultimate red flag.
The panic button.
Absolutely. If a patient arrives in the ER with chest pain and their blood work shows elevated troponin levels, the immediate universal clinical assumption is that they are actively experiencing a myocardial infarction, a heart attack.
Because troponin isn't supposed to be in the bloodstream at all, right? I mean, it's a structural protein that lives deep inside the heart muscle cells.
That's right.
Its job is to facilitate the actual physical contraction of the muscle fibers. So the logic is, if troponin is floating around in the blood, it means the heart cell must have ruptured and died, basically spilling its contents.
Which indicates irreversible necrosis, dead tissue.
Right.
That has been the foundational dogma of cardiology for decades. Irreversible cell death. But here is where endurance sports turn that dogma completely upside down.
This is the crazy part.
When researchers test the blood of healthy, completely asymptomatic endurance athletes immediately after a race, over 50% of them have circulating troponin levels that exceed the upper reference limit for a heart attack.
Over half of them.
Yes. And in many cases, the levels are vastly, wildly elevated, but they are absolutely not having heart attacks.
How is that even possible? If the cells aren't exploding and dying, how does the protein get out of the cell and into the blood in the first place?
The answer lies in the kinetics, the precise timeline, and the cellular mechanics of the release.
Okay, break that down for me.
During a true heart attack, where a blocked artery starves the heart of oxygen, the tissue dies en masse. The troponin levels spike and they stay elevated for many days, sometimes weeks, as the dead tissue slowly breaks down.
Right, it's a slow leak of a destroyed organ.
Exactly. But exercise-induced troponin elevation follows a totally different, incredibly rapid timeline.
The data shows that after a marathon, the troponin levels peak between 2 to 6 hours post-exercise, and they return to absolute baseline within 24 to 72 hours.
It's a rapid spike and a rapid clearance.
Which tells us we're dealing with reversible injury, not irreversible necrosis.
Precisely. The current scientific consensus points heavily toward a phenomenon involving increased cell membrane permeability.
Meaning the cell walls get leaky.
Yes. When the heart muscle is working at maximum capacity, it is subjected to immense mechanical stretch and a massive flood of oxidative stress. This combination causes the cardiomyocytes to suffer microscopic temporary wounds.
Oods.
Yeah, we refer to this process in the literature as blebbing.
Okay, hold on. Blebbing. That sounds like a 1950s sci-fi movie monster.
It's a great word, isn't it?
It's very evocative. What is physically happening to the heart cell during blebbing?
It is a highly specific biological mechanism. Imagine the outer membrane of the heart cell. Under extreme mechanical stress, a tiny section of that membrane bulges outward, forming a small blister, a bleb.
Okay.
Eventually, the pressure causes that tiny blister to pinch off and actually rupture.
Wait, so the cell does rupture?
Only the tiny blister, not the entire cell.
Oh, I see.
The reason the whole cell doesn't explode is twofold. First, the cytoplasm inside the cell isn't a liquid. It's a macromolecular gel, so it doesn't just instantly leak out like water from a balloon.
That makes sense.
Second, the cell membrane is anchored and stabilized by incredibly strong protein structures called dystrophin complexes. They hold the structural integrity of the cell together even when a microscopic bleb ruptures.
That is fascinating. So the cell wall springs a tiny microscopic leak, but the structural scaffolding holds the rest of the cell together.
Exactly. And inside the cell, there is a small, unbound pool of troponin fragments floating near the membrane. We call it the early releasable pool.
Okay.
When the bleb ruptures, those specific loose troponin fragments slip out through the temporary hole and enter the bloodstream. Then, within hours, the resilient cell membrane patches the leak and repairs itself. The cell survives.
Wow.
We can actually visualize this temporary increase in cellular permeability using specialized MRI sequences that measure something called mean diffusivity.
If I can try an analogy here, it sounds like troponin is basically the body's check engine light.
I like that.
In a hospital setting, if a sedentary person is sitting on the couch and the check engine light comes on, it means the engine has thrown a rod, it's seizing, and the car is dead.
Irreversible damage.
Right. But in an ultramarathon setting, you're saying the check engine light just means the engine is running incredibly hot, it's operating at red line, and it's leaking a tiny bit of oil out of a worn gasket.
Yes.
But the engine itself is still structurally sound and will cool down and patch itself by tomorrow.
That is a highly accurate and useful way to frame it. For the vast majority of athletes, this is a benign, physiological, and completely reversible leakage.
But I'm hearing a however coming.
However, as clinicians, we cannot simply dismiss every elevated troponin result as a harmless oil leak. There is a darker side to this.
Where does it cross the line into actual danger?
It crosses the line when we look at specific minority populations, particularly older master athletes who might be harboring underlying undiagnosed cardiovascular risk factors.
Like early stage coronary artery disease.
Exactly. In those individuals, that post-exercise troponin spike might not just be a physiological bleb. It could represent true apoptosis, which is programmed cell death, or even microscopic areas of genuine necrosis where the oxygen demand simply outstripped the supply.
So for a younger, healthy athlete, it's a bleb. For an older athlete with some plaque in their arteries, it could be actual microscopic heart damage.
Yes. And the longitudinal data supports this. In older populations, a significantly high post-exercise troponin spike has been shown to be an independent predictor of future major adverse cardiovascular events.
Wow.
It is a warning sign we have to take seriously.
And the research also points out that the type of sport you choose dictates how much troponin you leak. The sources explicitly compare running to cycling, and running triggers a vastly higher troponin release.
The difference is profound, and it really comes down to the biomechanics of the movement. Cycling is a smooth, concentric motion.
You're spinning.
Right. The heart works hard, but the physical trauma to the body is relatively low. Running, however, involves a massive eccentric muscle load and repetitive skeletal impact.
Pounding the pavement.
Every single time your foot strikes the pavement, you are sending a shock wave through your body. That skeletal trauma increases systemic inflammation, which compounds the oxidative stress on the heart, leading to more cellular blebbing and a higher troponin leak.
To highlight just how variable this troponin release can be, depending on the sport and the athlete's fitness, let's look at the 2024 study on elite cross-country skiers that we pulled from the sources.
Oh, yes, the German national team study.
Right. These were 36 top-tier athletes. They were tested after a brutal, grueling 2-day competition block. You would expect their troponin levels to be completely through the roof.
You really would. But the results were astonishingly low. Despite the extreme cardiovascular effort, only 8.1% of these elite skiers showed any elevated troponin I, and absolutely 0% had elevated troponin T.
0%. I mean, that is wild. What does that actually tell us?
It tells us two critical things. First, exercise-induced troponin elevation is not a universal guarantee. It varies massively based on the specific sport. Skiing has much less impact than running, as well as the duration, the intensity, and the individual athlete's biological adaptation.
So a really well-adapted heart might not leak at all.
Correct. Second, it highlights a crucial clinical nuance. Troponin I and troponin T have completely different cellular release dynamics. A cardiologist needs to know exactly which assay they're looking at, because troponin T seems to be much less prone to benign physiological leakage than troponin I.
Okay, so we've masked out the normal stressors. We've got the mechanical stretching of the right ventricle, and we've got the chemical leakage of troponin from microscopic blood.
The internal stressors.
Right, cells are stressed, they're leaking, and they're stressed. What happens if, at that exact moment of maximum vulnerability, an outside threat enters the system? Like if the walls are compromised, how does the heart defend itself against a foreign invader?
That is the pivotal question that bridges the gap between benign adaptation and catastrophic failure.
Because it's not benign anymore.
Not at all. When a foreign pathogen invades a stressed cardiovascular system, we move away from physiological quirks and enter the realm of acute clinical danger. We are talking about myocarditis and pericarditis.
Let's define those clearly, because these aren't just minor inconveniences that keep you out of a single race. The data is unequivocal. These two inflammatory conditions pose the absolute greatest acute risk for sudden cardiac death, or SCD, in the athletic population.
Yes, without question. Myocarditis is a direct viral or bacterial infection resulting in the inflammation of the heart muscle itself, the myocardium.
And pericarditis.
Pericarditis is the inflammation of the pericardium, which is the double-walled, fluid-filled sac that encases and protects the heart. And you are correct about the severity. Autopsy registries show that myocarditis accounts for anywhere from 6 to 14% of all sudden cardiac death cases in young athletes.
The primary triggers in developed nations are viral infections. We are talking about common bugs, adenovirus, enterovirus, and obviously SARS-CoV-2. But why are endurance athletes, who are ostensibly the healthiest people on the planet, so uniquely vulnerable to these viruses?
It comes down to a well-documented immunological phenomenon known as the open window hypothesis.
The open window.
Yes, we tend to view intense exercise as a shield that bolsters the immune system, and in moderation, it absolutely does. But immediately following an extreme, exhaustive endurance event, a marathon, a massive cycling stage, your body enters a temporary state of profound immunosuppression.
What exactly is happening in the immune system during that window?
Two major defense lines basically collapse. First, your natural killer cell activity plummets.
And those are the good guys.
Very much so. These are the white blood cells responsible for hunting down and destroying virally infected cells. Second, your levels of secretory IgA drop drastically.
I've heard of IgA, but what is its actual function?
Immunoglobulin A, or IgA, is an antibody that acts as your first line of defense in your mucous membranes, so your saliva, your nasal passages, your respiratory tract.
Okay, I see where this is going.
When you are breathing heavily for hours, you dry out those mucous membranes, and the sheer physical stress halts the production of IgA. You literally lose your frontline respiratory shield.
Wow.
This open window of vulnerability can persist for hours or even a few days after an extreme effort. If you encounter an airborne virus during this time, your defenses are down and the virus easily infiltrates the bloodstream.
But just catching a cold doesn't cause sudden cardiac death. The sources are very clear that the real danger zone, the mechanism that actually kills athletes, is dictated by the athlete's behavior after they contract the virus.
Exactly. The lethal mistake is the classic endurance athlete mindset. Oh, I'll just sweat it out. It's just a cold. I can train through it.
Break all been that.
It is the worst, most dangerous possible decision you can make.
Let's break down the mechanics of why that is so deadly. If I have an active viral infection in my bloodstream and I decide to go run 20 miles, what is happening at the cellular level inside my heart?
When you begin that intense run, your cardiac output skyrockets to meet the physical demand. At the same time, your adrenal glands release a massive flood of catecholamines, adrenaline, and noradrenaline.
Stress hormones.
Right. This combination of incredibly high blood flow and stress hormones acts like a physiological battering ram. It literally drives the circulating virus deep into the tissues of the myocardium.
So instead of the virus just floating in the blood, the exercise physically forces it to embed into the heart muscle itself.
Yes. The virus infiltrates the cardiomyocytes and begins to replicate.
Inside the heart?
Inside the heart. Your immune system eventually recognizes the infection, but because the virus is now inside the heart tissue, the immune system has to attack the heart to kill the virus.
Friendly fire.
Exactly. It launches a massive inflammatory response cytokines, T cells that inadvertently destroys the infected heart muscle cells. This process creates areas of focal necrosis. You literally end up with patches of dead, permanently destroyed heart tissue.
And what about pericarditis? If the infection settles in the sac around the heart, how does exercise make that worse?
With pericarditis, the danger is heavily mechanical. The pericardium is a double-layered sac, and normally the layers glide smoothly over each other, lubricated by a tiny amount of fluid.
Like a well-oiled machine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But when it becomes inflamed from a virus, those layers swell and become rough, like sandpaper.
So if I have pericarditis and I go for a run, elevating my heart rate to, say, 160 beats per minute.
You are drastically increasing the shear stress across those inflamed layers. The heart is expanding and contracting forcefully against a rough, swollen surface. It is the physiological equivalent of rubbing coarse sandpaper directly over an open blister 160 times a minute for an hour.
That is a horrifying image.
It is incredibly destructive. That shear stress exponentially exacerbates the inflammation. It forces the tissues to leak fluid, leading to a pericardial effusion.
Fluid buildup.
Right. A dangerous buildup of fluid around the heart that can compress the chambers. In severe chronic cases, the inflammation causes the sac to scar and harden into a rigid shell.
Oh, yeah.
It's a condition called constrictive pericarditis, which physically prevents the heart from expanding and filling with blood.
We have to address the elephant in the room regarding viral myocarditis, because for the last few years, the entire sports world was just hyper fixated on one specific virus, COVID-19.
It was inescapable.
Early in the pandemic, there were a handful of MRI studies done on young student athletes returning to play, and they showed alarmingly high rates of heart inflammation. It caused absolute panic. Seasons were canceled, careers were paused.
And, the initial reaction was understandable given the fear and the novelty of the virus. But science is an iterative process. Those early studies were small, retrospective, and often lacked proper control groups. When we finally gathered the later, massive, large-scale prospective data from 2021 onwards, looking at thousands of athletes across multiple sports, a completely different, much clearer picture emerged.
What did the real data actually show?
It showed that the actual clinical incidence of COVID-19 myocarditis in the athletic population is incredibly low. Across the major registries, the incidence rate sits at roughly 0.7%.
Less than 1%.
Less than 1%.
So the panic, while understandable at the time, was largely disproportionate to the actual clinical prevalence in athletes.
Yes. In fact, the data reveals that athletes actually have a lower incidence of severe COVID-19 myocarditis than the general sedentary public.
Why is that? I mean, if they have the open window immune suppression we just talked about, shouldn't they be more at risk?
The open window makes them susceptible to catching the virus, but their overall biological resilience dictates how their body handles the infection once it's inside.
Their baseline fitness protects them.
Exactly. Athletes have vastly superior baseline cardiovascular health, highly efficient endothelial function, and a distinct lack of chronic comorbidities like obesity, type 2 diabetes, and chronic hypertension.
Which were the major risk factors for severe COVID.
Exactly. This robust baseline health acted as a massive protective buffer against the severe systemic inflammatory cascades that caused so much cardiac damage in the general population.
That is a huge relief, but the guidelines still mandate caution, right?
Yeah.
You can't just ignore a COVID infection.
Absolutely not. Because while the incidence of myocarditis is very low, that 0.7%, the consequences of missing a diagnosis are catastrophic.
Right.
That tiny percentage of athletes who do develop myocarditis are at extremely high risk for lethal ventricular arrhythmias if they train. The low incidence rate does not mean we abandon screening protocols. It just means we don't need to preemptively panic.
So who do we screen?
We focus the advanced screening on athletes who actually display persistent cardiac symptoms, chest pain, shortness of breath, palpitations after the initial viral phase has passed.
So as an endurance athlete listening to this, the ultimate practical question is always the same. At what exact point is a cold just a mild cold? And at what point am I risking sudden cardiac death by lacing up my running shoes?
To answer that, cardiologists look at the J-curve model of exercise and immunity.
The curve.
Imagine a graph shaped like the letter J. At the flat bottom part of the hook is moderate, daily exercise, a light jog, a brisk walk. This zone is highly cardioprotective and actually enhances your baseline immune function.
Okay, that's the healthy zone.
But as you move up the steep vertical stem of the J into heavy, exhaustive, extreme exertion, your risk of developing upper respiratory tract infections multiplies by 2 to 6 times.
So how do we actually navigate the symptoms when we're in that high-risk zone?
We use the neck check rule as a preliminary guide.
The neck check.
If your symptoms are strictly above the neck, a mild runny nose, isolated nasal congestion, a slight scratchy throat light to moderate exercise in that bottom J curve zone might be acceptable, provided your resting heart rate is normal.
Okay, so a head cold is usually okay to jog through.
Usually, yes. But if your symptoms migrate below the neck, if you have a fever, profound systemic body aches, a deep bronchial cough, excessive fatigue, or any hint of chest pain, total rest is absolutely non-negotiable.
And if the worst happens and a doctor officially diagnoses you with acute pericarditis or myocarditis, what does the recovery actually look like? Can you do like light spinning on stationary bike?
No. Total rest means total rest. For acute inflammation, the standard protocol mandates 2 to 4 weeks of absolute minimum exertion, followed by a very slow, highly monitored return to play.
That's tough for an athlete to hear.
It is, but you cannot fitness your way out of an inflamed heart. Trying to maintain your VO2 max while your heart is fighting an infection is a recipe for permanent scarring or sudden death.
Okay, so acute viral infections require immediate, non-negotiable rest. But what happens if you never get sick? Or if you do everything right, you rest when you have a fever, but you spend decades running 50 or 60 miles a week?
Ah, the chronic burden.
Exactly. That brings us to the slow, silent accumulation of mechanical stress. Let's look at chronic maladaptations and what happens to the heart over 20 years of extreme volume.
This is where we enter the fascinating and somewhat controversial territory of the Pheidippides paradigm.
Oh, from ancient Greece.
Yes, Pheidippides, according to legend, was the ancient Greek messenger who ran roughly 150 miles from Sparta to Athens to deliver news of a military victory, shouted his message, and then immediately dropped dead from exhaustion.
It's the ultimate cautionary tale for runners.
In modern sports cardiology, researchers have proposed a clinical syndrome termed Pheidippides cardiomyopathy. It describes a specific pattern of chronic cardiac remodeling seen in some veteran endurance athletes.
And we need to be clear here, this isn't just a healthy, benign athlete's heart adaptation where the walls get a little thicker to pump more blood. This is a pathological state.
Right, this is not benign.
It is characterized by excessive balloon-like chamber dilation, abnormal myocardial hypertrophy, and crucially, the presence of patchy myocardial fibrosis.
Fibrosis is the medical term for scarring. It is the replacement of healthy, functional muscle tissue with rigid collagen. And when we look at the prevalence data for fibrosis in lifelong endurance athletes, the numbers are sobering.
How sobering.
Multiple systematic reviews and meta-analyses utilizing advanced cardiac MRI techniques have shown that between 13% and 48% of high volume, veteran endurance athletes exhibit late gadolinium enhancement.
Let's break down that MRI technology so we understand exactly what we're looking at. What is late gadolinium enhancement, or LGE?
Gadolinium is an intravenous contrast agent given to a patient during an MRI. When it enters healthy, densely packed heart muscle, it washes in and washes right back out very quickly.
Because the tissue is tight.
Exactly. But scar tissue is different. Fibrosis expands the extracellular space, the area between the cells, creating a spongy matrix.
Like a sponge absorbing water.
Exactly. The gadolinium contrast gets trapped in that fibrotic matrix and lingers there. When the MRI scans the heart a few minutes later, those trapped areas light up incredibly bright white on the image. That delayed brightening is called late gadolinium enhancement.
So LGE is literally a glowing map of scar tissue on the heart.
Yes.
And 13 to 48% of veteran athletes have these glowing scars. How does that compare to people who don't run ultramarathons?
In the general healthy non-athletic population, the prevalence of LGE is only about 3%.
Wow.
So we are seeing a massive, undeniably significant increase in myocardial scarring among athletes who subject themselves to extreme chronic volume.
But why? Running is supposed to be healthy. How does a habit that lowers blood pressure and burns fat actively cause a scar to form on the heart?
It connects directly back to the mechanical stress we discussed in the very beginning. Decades of stretching the myocardial walls under massive volume overload triggers a deeply embedded biochemical cascade.
Okay, take me through the cascade.
That constant mechanical stretching elevates specific signaling pathways in the cells, most notably the TGF beta and SMAD pathways.
Hold on, you just threw an alphabet soup of acronyms at me. TGF beta, SMAD. Let's slow down. What do these pathways actually do in plain English?
Apologies. Think of TGF beta as a cellular foreman on a construction site.
Okay, the foreman.
When the heart muscle stretches too much, the foreman panics and yells at the workers the SMAD proteins to reinforce the walls. The workers respond by drastically upregulating the production of procollagen type I.
And collagen is the structural protein that makes up scar tissue. It's the bricks.
Exactly. The heart is frantically laying down extra bricks to reinforce the stretching walls. Now, normally your body has a built-in regulatory system. You have enzymes called matrix metalloproteinases, or MMPs.
Another acronym.
Think of them as the demolition crew. Their job is to break down and clear away excess collagen so the tissue doesn't get too stiff.
So the foreman is laying bricks, and the demolition crew is cleaning up the mess, keeping a perfect balance.
In a healthy state, yes. But in the chronic high-volume state of an ultra-marathoner, the mechanical stress is relentless. The foreman is screaming for more bricks 204/7.
So the demolition crew gets overwhelmed.
The production of collagen overwhelms the system, and the MMP demolition crew simply cannot keep up with the repair demands. When that balance is lost, pathological cross-linking occurs. The excess collagen binds together, hardens, and forms permanent interstitial fibrosis.
And researchers don't even need an MRI to know this is happening, right? They can actually track this fibrotic construction site by looking at the blood. They look for elevated biomarkers like galectin-3 and soluble ST2.
Correct. Elevated levels of those specific markers indicate that the fibroblasts, the actual cellular machines manufacturing the collagen, are persistently activated and aggressively laying down scar tissue.
But we have to make a vital, life-saving clinical distinction here, because not all scar tissue is the same. The research clearly separates this fibrosis into two distinct categories: interstitial fibrosis and reparative fibrosis.
This is perhaps the most important nuance in sports cardiology. Interstitial fibrosis is a diffuse, widespread structural reinforcement.
Diffuse, meaning spread out.
Right. The heart is laying down a microscopic collagen framework between the existing healthy muscle cells to handle the immense mechanical load.
I like to think of interstitial fibrosis like a callus on a rock climber's hand. It's a localized thickening of the tissue caused by friction and stress. It might look a little rough, but it is fundamentally adaptive. It protects the hand from tearing.
That is a perfect analogy. Interstitial fibrosis is generally considered benign. It is a biological callus. But reparative fibrosis is a completely different, highly dangerous pathology.
A bad kind of scar.
Yes. This is dense, patchy scarring that occurs when actual myocardial tissue dies, perhaps from that microscopic troponin necrosis or a silent viral infection, and the body replaces the dead muscle with a thick wad of rigid collagen.
To continue the analogy, if interstitial fibrosis is a protective callus, reparative fibrosis is a deep, jagged surgical scar that permanently limits the mobility and function of the muscle.
Exactly. And the MRI can tell the difference based on the pattern and the anatomical location of the scar. The sources emphasize that a specific pattern, patchy subepicardial LGE,
Which means what structurally?
meaning dense scars located on the outer layer of the heart, often right where the right ventricle attaches to the septum, that specific pattern is a massive red flag.
Why is that specific location so dangerous?
Because it actively disrupts the heart's electrical grid. One critical study noted that 22% of athletes who exhibited this specific patchy LGE pattern eventually experienced malignant arrhythmias.
Because scar tissue is just dense collagen. It doesn't conduct electricity the same way healthy, fluid heart muscle does.
Precisely. The human heart relies on a highly synchronized, beautifully coordinated electrical wave to contract rhythmically and pump blood.
The pacemaker signal.
Right. When that fast-moving electrical impulse suddenly hits a dense, non-conductive patch of reparative fibrosis, the signal scatters. It slows down, it fractures, and it begins to loop back on itself.
It creates a short circuit.
Yes. That scarred area becomes an electrical substrate, a perfect breeding ground for dangerous arrhythmias. In the upper chambers, it leads to atrial fibrillation. But in the lower chambers, it can trigger ventricular tachycardia, which rapidly degenerates into ventricular fibrillation.
And that's lethal.
And that is the direct mechanism of sudden cardiac death. The heart stops pumping blood and simply quivers.
Okay, I need to pause because I feel like we just thoroughly terrified our listeners.
It is intense material.
We started with the joy of crossing a finish line, And we have systematically talked about right ventricle dilation, troponin leaks, viral necrosis, massive collagen buildup, and patchy scarring that causes sudden death.
It sounds bleak when you stack it up like that.
If I'm a runner listening to this, I am seriously contemplating throwing my shoes in the trash. We have to answer the ultimate underlying question. Is endurance sports actually protective, or is it secretly harmful?
It is entirely understandable to feel alarm when we isolate and magnify the specific mechanisms of cardiac injury. But we must zoom out and look at the overwhelming macroscopic body of epidemiological evidence.
The big picture.
We cannot let the fear of a rare electrical short circuit blind us to the undeniable truth. Elite endurance athletes and lifelong master athletes boast a significantly increased life expectancy compared to the general sedentary population.
So on a macro level, endurance training is highly protective.
Unquestionably. The profound cardiovascular benefits, the unmatched metabolic efficiency, the near total protection against obesity, type 2 diabetes, and systemic hypertension. These systemic life-extending factors far, far outweigh the isolated cardiac risks for the vast majority of people.
Well, there is a but.
There is always a but. If you fit the profile of a master athlete, which the literature typically defines as an individual aged 35 and older who has been training at high volumes and intensities for decades, you carry a very unique, highly specific set of risks that simply do not exist in the sedentary population.
And the data points to two major anomalies in these older runners: a spike in atrial fibrillation and bizarrely high coronary artery calcium scores.
Yes, the AFib and the K.
Let's tackle AFib first. Master athletes have a 3 to 5-fold higher risk of developing atrial fibrillation compared to non-athletes.
Atrial fibrillation, or AFib, is an irregular, often very rapid heartbeat in the upper chambers of the heart. While not immediately lethal on its own, it drastically increases the risk of stroke and heart failure over time.
Why do athletes get it more?
The increased risk in athletes is a direct result of the chronic volume overload. The upper chambers, the atria, physically stretch to accommodate the massive blood flow, and that stretching combined with the inflammation and potential interstitial fibrosis we discussed disrupts the electrical pathways.
But the second anomaly is the one that really breaks my brain: coronary artery calcium, or ICAC. The sources show that nearly 20% of male master athletes have a CAC score over 100 Agatston units.
Which is a profound clinical paradox.
Because in standard cardiology, if a sedentary, overweight 50-year-old patient gets a CT scan and their CAC score is over 100, the alarms sound. High calcium means their coronary arteries are filled with atherosclerotic plaque. It is a massive red flag for a looming, potentially fatal heart attack.
Exactly.
But you're saying 20% of these super fit, lean, lifelong marathon runners have heavily calcified arteries. How is that possible? Why do they have the arteries of a diseased patient?
That is the mystery that cardiologists are currently unraveling. But here is the most crucial part of the paradox. Despite having these terrifyingly high calcium scores, longitudinal studies show that the all-cause mortality and the actual heart attack rate of these runners remains significantly lower than sedentary peers with the exact same score.
Wait, if two guys both have a high calcium score, why does the sedentary guy have a heart attack but the runner doesn't? Are the athlete's arteries just fundamentally different?
The current hypothesis focuses on the morphology, the physical composition of the plaque itself. It seems to be related to the relentless physical mechanics of exercise.
Mechanics again.
Always. As an athlete, your heart is beating forcefully, constantly bending and flexing the coronary arteries over millions and millions of cardiac cycles. Combined with the transient, low-grade systemic inflammation from training, the body realizes these arteries are under immense stress.
So the body tries to protect them.
Yes. The theory is that the body aggressively calcifies the plaques to stabilize them. In a sedentary person, the plaque is often soft, lipid-rich, and highly unstable.
It's mushy.
It's a soft pimple waiting to pop, cause a blood clot, and trigger a heart attack. But in the athlete, the relentless mechanical stress forces the body to calcify the plaque into a dense, smooth, rock-hard sheet. It is much denser and vastly more stable.
It's like turning a fragile piece of sandstone into a solid piece of granite. The blockage is still technically there, which registers on the scan, but it's not going to rupture and kill you.
That is the leading biological explanation. The calcium is a stabilizing scar, not an active, festering wound.
That is wild. It sounds like endurance training is basically an incredibly powerful, almost magical medication. It functionally cures the biggest metabolic diseases in modern society. It lowers your risk of stroke, diabetes, and heart failure. But the side effects profile on the warning label is just absolutely bizarre.
It really is.
Warning: may cause elevated troponin leaks, right ventricular ballooning, and rock-hard artery calcification.
It is an incredibly pertinent biological intervention. And because of these bizarre extreme side effects, the diagnostic challenge for a sports cardiologist is immense.
How do you even read their charts?
How do you look at an abnormal test result and accurately differentiate a healthy, highly adapted athlete's heart from a true deadly cardiomyopathy?
Because an athlete's resting ECG looks terrifying to a normal primary care doctor, right?
It often looks highly pathological to an untrained eye. A master athlete might walk into a clinic with a resting heart rate of 35 beats per minute,
Which is crazy low.
Their ECG will show massive QRS voltage spikes simply because their heart muscle is so thick. They will exhibit early repolarization changes and sinus arrhythmias. To a general practitioner, these look like signs of heart block or severe disease.
But they're actually just benign physiological adaptations to the volume load.
Exactly. But the danger is that these benign adaptations overlap heavily with the actual signs of genetic heart disease. The clinical key is identifying the subtle, truly pathological changes like deep T-wave inversions in very specific lateral leads that point away from adaptation and toward true cardiomyopathy.
Which brings us perfectly to how the medical community is actively handling this tightrope walk today. Let's look at the current recommendations and what we still don't know. How are sports cardiologists applying all this complex data to keep athletes safe right now?
Over the past few years, there has been a massive welcome paradigm shift in sports cardiology, which is explicitly reflected in the newest 2025 ACHA Return to Play guidelines.
Before we get to the new rules, what was the old approach?
Historically, the approach to any cardiac inflammation was incredibly conservative and highly paternalistic.
Just ban everything.
Basically, if an athlete was diagnosed with myocarditis, they were universally disqualified from all athletic participation for 3 to 6 months, absolute minimum. No exceptions.
Which, if you are a professional athlete whose livelihood depends on their body, or even a highly dedicated amateur whose entire social and mental well-being is tied to running, is absolutely devastating.
It was emotionally and physically catastrophic. We call it the physiological cost of detraining.
Detraining.
When you force an elite athlete to become completely sedentary for 6 months, they lose their mitochondrial density, their plasma volume drops, their metabolic health deteriorates, and the psychological toll of losing their identity often leads to severe clinical depression.
So what changed in the 2025 guidelines?
The medical community finally acknowledged the severe collateral damage of these blanket bans. The shift is moving aggressively toward nuanced shared decision-making.
Treating them like adults.
Yes. The new 2025 guidelines dictate that an athlete recovering from acute myocarditis can potentially return to full training in as little as 4 to 6 weeks.
That is a massive reduction. But I assume they can't just jump right back into a marathon. There must be incredibly strict medical gateways they have to pass.
Very strict. We don't just guess that they are healed. The athlete must be completely 100% symptom-free. Their cardiac biomarkers, the troponin we discussed, and inflammatory markers like CRP must have returned to absolute baseline.
And the pump has to be working.
Right. An echocardiogram must show a completely normal ejection fraction, meaning the pump is functioning perfectly.
And what about the scarring?
That is the final crucial gateway. A follow-up cardiac MRI must show a complete resolution of the acute myocardial edema, the swelling, and it must confirm that no dangerous reparative fibrosis has formed.
Okay, so if you pass all that,
If the athlete passes all those imaging gates, they undergo a 24-hour Holter monitor and a maximal exercise stress test. If they can hit their max heart rate without triggering any dangerous ventricular arrhythmias, the cardiologist can confidently clear them to resume training.
okay, that covers the athletes who get acutely sick. But what about screening the healthy older athletes? The 50-year-old guys and gals running their 10th marathon who are worried about silent scarring. Should everyone over 40 demand a cardiac MRI to check for that patchy LGE fibrosis?
Actually, the guidelines strongly advise against routine advanced imaging like MRIs or CT scans for asymptomatic master athletes.
Really? Even with the high rates of scarring we talked about, why wouldn't we want to look?
Because of the callus versus scar issue we discussed. If you scan 100 healthy master athletes, you are going to find interstitial fibrosis or high calcium scores in many of them.
The benign adaptations.
Right. But without symptoms, we don't know if that finding is a dangerous pathology or a benign adaptation. Routine screening generates a massive wave of false positives, unnecessary anxiety, and potentially harmful invasive follow-up procedures for anomalies that were never going to hurt the athlete.
So if routine MRIs are out, what is the best way to screen them?
The emphasis remains on the proven basics. The 14-point AHA history and physical examination. The doctor needs to ask the right targeted questions.
Like what?
Is there a family history of sudden death before age 50? Have you experienced unexplained fainting during a run? Do you have disproportionate shortness of breath? And critically, an expert-interpreted 12-lead ECG is vital.
You emphasized expert interpreted?
Yes, because as we noted, an athlete's ECG looks abnormal. A cardiologist who specifically understands the unique electrical adaptations of the athlete's heart must be the one reading the readout, or you risk unnecessary disqualification.
So if you shouldn't get an MRI every year, how do you, as an individual athlete, monitor your heart stress levels on your own? We can't draw our own troponin levels every morning, but the sources point heavily to a metric that is built into almost every modern smartwatch, HRV or heart rate variability.
HRV is a phenomenal, non-invasive, real-time window into your autonomic nervous system. Specifically, we look at the RMSSD metric, which measures the microsecond variance between successive heartbeats.
Okay, let me try to translate HRV into actionable advice, because it confuses a lot of people.
It can be tricky.
Generally speaking, a high HRV is good and a low HRV is bad. A high HRV means there is a lot of variance between your heartbeats, which indicates that your parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest side that slows you down, is strong, flexible, and actively engaged.
That is correct. But the mechanism is what makes it so relevant to heart inflammation. That parasympathetic tone doesn't just slow your heart rate down, it actively operates as a profound, systemic anti-inflammatory reflex.
An anti-inflammatory reflex.
Yes. A strong parasympathetic signal literally suppresses the immune system's production of pro-inflammatory cytokines, specifically TNF-alpha and IL-6.
Wow. So having a high HRV physically stops the body from flooding the heart with inflammatory chemicals?
Yes. Conversely, a sustained multi-day drop in your HRV relative to your personal baseline is your body's ultimate early warning system.
It's the check engine light flashing.
Exactly. It means you are overreaching. Your sympathetic fight or flight system is dominating, your parasympathetic shield has dropped, and your systemic inflammatory load is running too high. That is when the heart is vulnerable to damage.
It sounds like even with HRV and ECGs, cardiologists are basically trying to land a plane in the fog when it comes to managing older athletes. We have some decent instruments on the dashboard, but we don't have perfect, crystal clear visibility into what the heart is actually doing.
The fog is lifting, but we must humbly acknowledge that there are still major unknowns in sports cardiology. We have vastly better radar now with advanced MRI techniques like T1 mapping, which can quantify the exact volume of extracellular space.
But there are blind spots.
Many. Researchers still do not fully understand the exact cellular trigger that causes the reversible troponin bleb.
And we still don't know the exact tipping point where healthy adaptation turns deadly.
Right. We don't know the precise threshold where benign adaptive interstitial fibrosis suddenly crosses over into pathological arrhythmogenic reparative fibrosis.
And the calcium mystery.
And we are still actively studying what those extremely high coronary calcium scores truly mean for a runner as they enter their 70s and 80s. Finding the precise individualized dose of extreme exercise that maximizes longevity while totally minimizing chronic cardiac injury remains the holy grail of sports cardiology.
Well, since we know that chronic inflammation is the enemy of recovery, and we know we can track that inflammatory load using HRV, let's transition to the practical application.
What can we actually do about it?
Right. How can we actively lower that inflammation using proven nutrition? This brings us to evidence-based anti-inflammatory strategies. And I have to say, looking at the research, the sports nutrition world is absolutely saturated with myths and snake oil.
It is an industry entirely plagued by exaggerated marketing claims and a fundamental misunderstanding of physiology. If we want to protect the heart, we need to strip away the marketing and focus strictly on what large-scale, human randomized controlled trials actually prove.
Let's start by busting the two biggest myths that endurance athletes cling to. Myth number one, popping NSAIDs like ibuprofen or naproxen, or immediately jumping into a freezing ice bath after every single hard run is the best way to reduce inflammation and speed up recovery.
That approach is profoundly counterproductive. It highlights a misunderstanding of what acute inflammation actually is.
Because inflammation isn't always bad.
Exactly. That initial painful inflammatory cascade after a workout is not a mistake. It is a required biological signal. The cytokines and macrophages rushing into your muscles are what trigger the repair process, the mitochondrial biogenesis, and the strengthening of the tissue.
So if you take an NSAID or freeze your legs,
You severely chemically blunt that natural inflammatory signal. You are actively interfering with and halting the very muscle repair and cardiovascular adaptation that you just spent 3 hours running to achieve.
you're undoing your own training.
You are erasing your own hard work. Those tools, NSAIDs and ice baths, should be strictly reserved for treating acute traumatic injuries like a sprained ankle, not for routine daily training recovery.
Myth number 2. Generic turmeric capsules and CBD oil are the ultimate daily supplements for runners' inflammation.
Let's separate those. Generic turmeric powder or standard capsules have notoriously poor bioavailability.
Your body just can't absorb it.
Right. Curcumin, the active anti-inflammatory compound in turmeric, is rapidly degraded by your digestive system. It is metabolized by the liver and excreted before it ever reaches your bloodstream in a meaningful concentration. You are essentially generating very expensive urine.
And what about CBD? Because, you literally cannot walk into a running store without seeing CBD balms, tinctures, and gummies promising to cure inflammation.
Despite the massive media hype and aggressive marketing, there are simply no robust, large-scale, peer-reviewed, randomized controlled trials proving that CBD effectively aids exercise recovery or significantly reduces systemic inflammation in healthy athletic populations.
So it's mostly hype right now.
It is almost entirely marketing and placebo at this stage of the science.
I have to ask about collagen too, because I see that pushed constantly as a recovery miracle.
Collagen supplementation has decent emerging evidence for supporting joint cartilage and tendon health, absolutely, but it is not a systemic anti-inflammatory agent. Marketing it as a cure for heart inflammation or systemic cardiovascular stress vastly overstates the clinical science.
Okay, so if those are the myths, what are the daily habits that actually cause the bad chronic inflammation? It's not just the sheer volume of miles, it's how you execute them. The sources point out that the biggest dietary and training culprit is accumulated intensity and glycogen depletion.
Accumulated intensity is a massive error. It means running your easy recovery runs too fast.
The gray zone.
Right. If you are constantly operating in that moderate gray zone, your sympathetic nervous system never powers down and you never clear the inflammatory load from the previous workout.
Add in chronic glycogen depletion running on empty and insufficient sleep, and your HRV will absolutely plummet.
Sleep is the most potent, powerful, anti-inflammatory recovery tool in human existence. No combination of supplements, diets, or therapies can outwork a chronic sleep deficit.
But assuming your sleep architecture and your polarized training structure are dialed in, there are specific nutritional supplements that have strong, undeniable, evidence-backed roles in managing chronic, low-grade systemic inflammation.
Yes, there are proven interventions.
We've gone through the clinical data and ranked them based purely on the strength of the evidence. Coming in at number 1 with the absolute strongest human clinical data, curcumin. But, as we just discussed, there is a massive catch regarding how you take it.
The catch is the bioavailability issue. To make curcumin actually work systemically, human trials definitively show you must pair it with piperine, which is a specific black pepper extract.
The patented version is often called bioprine. The sources cite a truly landmark 1998 study showing that adding just 20 milligrams of piperine to a curcumin dose increases the bioavailability of the curcumin by 2,000%.
It's an incredible synergy.
2,000%. That is staggering. How does black pepper do that?
Piperine acts as a potent metabolic inhibitor. It temporarily blocks the specific digestive enzymes in your gut and liver that normally destroy the curcumin molecule.
It gives it a free pass.
By inhibiting those enzymes, the curcumin is allowed to pass intact through the intestinal wall and into your systemic circulation, where it can actually interact with the inflammatory pathways.
And what's the recommended dose?
The evidence for taking a 500 milligram daily dose of a standardized curcumin extract, specifically paired with piperine, is highly robust for reducing delayed onset muscle soreness and blunting systemic markers of cardiovascular stress.
But the critical error I see people make is inconsistent dosing. You can't just pop a curcumin pill on Sunday afternoon when your legs are sore and expect it to work instantly like an aspirin.
Exactly right. Curcumin does not work acutely. It alters the biological environment chronically.
It's a flow build.
It builds a steady background anti-inflammatory effect by modulating gene expression over time. The positive clinical studies all involve consistent, unbroken daily use over a period of 4 to 8 weeks to reach therapeutic efficacy.
Moving to number 2 on the clinical evidence list, omega-3 fatty acids. Specifically, the active components EPA and DHA derived from high-quality fish oil or algae oil.
Omega-3s have a beautifully well-documented physiological mechanism. The cells in your body, including your heart cells, are encased in a lipid membrane. When you consume high amounts of omega-3s, they physically incorporate themselves into those cell membranes, actively competing with pro-inflammatory omega-6 fatty acids.
So they crowd out the bad stuff.
Yes. By crowding out the omega-6s, they favorably alter the production of eicosanoids, which are the localized signaling molecules that regulate the intensity of the inflammatory response.
But once again, dosing is a failure point for most athletes. A standard, cheap grocery store fish oil pill might only have 300 milligrams of combined EPA and DHA.
Which is nowhere near enough.
The clinical trials that actually show a reduction in inflammation and cardiovascular stress after eccentric exercise use massive doses, typically 2 to 4 full grams of EPA and DHA daily. You need that high sustained dose to push your cellular omega-3 index above the clinically protective threshold of 8%.
Moving to number 3 on our ranked list, and this is absolutely crucial because it applies to the actual act of running itself. Carbohydrate availability during the workout.
I absolutely love this one because it turns fueling into an anti-inflammatory strategy. Taking in 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour, usually a scientifically formulated maltodextrin and fructose mix during a long run, doesn't just give you energy, it massively blunts the release of stress hormones.
It alters the entire hormonal profile of the exercise session. When you run low on muscle glycogen and blood glucose drops, your brain registers an acute energy crisis. It panics.
We're running out of fuel.
Exactly. To mobilize emergency fuel, the brain commands the adrenal glands to release a massive flood of cortisol, and the immune system pumps out pro-inflammatory cytokines like IL-6. This creates a highly toxic inflammatory environment for the heart.
I compare it to trying to keep a house warm in the winter. If you keep throwing fresh wood carbohydrates on the fire, the house stays warm, the system is happy, and everything functions smoothly.
A good state to be in.
But if you run out of wood, the body panics. It starts ripping the wooden furniture apart, and then it starts tearing down the literal walls of the house to throw into the fire just to survive. That destruction of the walls is the cortisol stress response. Keep the carbs coming, and you protect the walls.
An excellent, if slightly destructive, analogy. By continually feeding the system exogenous carbohydrates, you prevent that central crisis signal from ever firing. You drastically lower the post-exercise inflammatory response and spare the cardiovascular system from that cortisol bath.
Number 4 on our list is tart cherry juice.
Tart cherry is incredibly rich in specific antioxidants called anthocyanins. However, unlike curcumin or omega-3s, the clinical evidence suggests it is best utilized acutely rather than as a year-round daily supplement.
Right. The strongest data, specifically the well-known 2010 Howitson study on marathon runners, shows a significant clinical benefit when tart cherry is consumed in a very specific targeted window around a massive effort.
The protocol is very strict.
Usually 5 days before a major race, on the day of the race itself, and for 2 days afterward. It acts as a targeted strike to speed acute muscle recovery and drastically reduce inflammatory markers for that specific extreme event.
Rounding out the primary list, we have coenzyme Q10 or CoQ10. This is a vital compound that acts as a powerful antioxidant directly inside the mitochondria, the energy powerhouses of the cells.
And how does it help the heart specifically?
Recent studies have demonstrated that CoQ10 supplementation actively reduces post-exercise cardiac stress markers. Specifically, it lowers the release of the exact markers we discussed in section 2, the NT-proBNP and the highly sensitive troponin T leaks.
And finally, sitting at the foundation of all of this is vitamin D.
Vitamin D is not a direct active anti-inflammatory agent in the way curcumin is, but it is an absolute essential baseline for physiological function. Human studies explicitly and repeatedly link vitamin D deficiency with chronically elevated circulating inflammatory biomarkers in endurance runners.
So if your vitamin D is low, your baseline inflammation is automatically high.
Exactly. Maintaining a blood serum level over 30 nanograms per milliliter is non-negotiable for proper immune function and inflammatory regulation.
Especially in the winter.
This is especially critical for athletes who train heavily during the dark winter months in northern climates, where natural cutaneous vitamin D synthesis drops to 0.
We have covered a truly massive, staggering amount of physiological ground today. We started by looking at the sheer fluid dynamics and the mechanical stretching of the thin-walled right ventricle.
The foundation of the stress.
We zoomed in to the microscopic cellular level to understand how dystrophin complexes hold the cell together while troponin blebs leak out. We navigated the very real, terrifying dangers of viral myocarditis and the open window of immune suppression.
The acute threats.
And we waded deeply into the murky, complex waters of chronic fibrosis, collagen cross-linking, and the paradox of high calcium scores in master athletes.
It is a complex landscape, but we can distill it into clear, actionable takeaways for the athlete. First and foremost, acute heart inflammation, such as a viral infection, requires absolute non-negotiable rest.
You have to respect it.
You must respect the J-curve of immunity and never, ever train through a fever or systemic symptoms. Doing so risks irreversible necrosis and sudden death.
But on the other side of the coin,
On the other side, the chronic stress of endurance sports is, for the vast majority of participants, a profoundly adaptive and life-extending pursuit. Your right ventricle is structurally vulnerable to pressure, and benign troponin leaks will happen after massive efforts.
part of the process.
But you have the agency to actively manage and mitigate that cumulative systemic inflammatory load.
You do that by controlling the variables you can touch. Dial in your sleep architecture. Strictly enforce the discipline of keeping your easy runs truly easy to avoid the gray zone.
Don't run on empty.
Right. Fuel your long efforts with continuous intra-workout carbohydrates to prevent the cortisol crisis. And strategically utilize the specific evidence-backed supplements like highly bioavailable curcumin with pauperine and high-dose omega-3s to alter your chronic cellular environment.
And track your recovery.
Most importantly, track your HRV baseline to ensure your parasympathetic nervous system is actually deploying as anti-inflammatory shield.
Ultimately, the human heart is not a fragile piece of glass. It is an incredibly resilient, dynamic, and highly responsive organ. It adapts to the extreme demands we place upon it.
Which leads me to a final, slightly provocative thought I want to leave our listeners with. Throughout this entire deep dive, we have been looking at this phenomenon of subclinical myocardial fibrosis, that interstitial extra collagen buildup, as a scar.
As a pathology.
We have framed it as a potential disease state, but we are viewing that through the traditional lens of clinical cardiology, a field that was built entirely around studying sick, sedentary people whose hearts are failing.
That's a fascinating point.
But consider the immense, entirely unnatural, sustained biological output of a human being running 100 miles through the mountains in a single day. What if this fibrotic remodeling isn't a defect at all?
You were suggesting that the clinical terminology is failing to capture a necessary structural evolution?
Exactly. What if, when we look at these brightly glowing MRI scans of lifelong veteran ultrarunners, we aren't actually looking at damaged, failing hearts?
What are we looking at then?
What if, instead, we are witnessing the real-time, magnificent evolutionary adaptation of the human heart? What if it is deliberately, structurally reinforcing its own walls with a dense collagen scaffolding simply to survive and thrive in extreme, punishing environments it was never originally designed for?
It is a profound paradigm shift. It challenges the entire medical community to completely redefine what the word normal means when we are evaluating the extreme athlete.
And finding that new definition of normal is exactly what we aim to do here. So to you, the listener, respect your rest, fuel your miles properly so you don't burn the house down, listen closely to the signals your nervous system is sending you, and keep exploring the absolute limits of human potential.
Take care of your heart.
Tomorrow morning, when you swing your heavy legs out of bed and feel that deep, lingering ache after a massive race, take a moment to appreciate the incredible, resilient, wildly adaptable hidden engine inside your chest that made every single step possible. Until next time, keep diving at the finish line of a major ultramarathon, say like 130 kilometers through the mountains. You're watching these runners cross the line, and they're covered in dirt, dried sweat, salt crusting on their skin.
Right, they look utterly exhausted.
Exactly, exhausted.
Right.
But they also look like the absolute picture of peak human health, right? I mean, they just conquered a mountain.
Yeah, you would think so.
But if you were to take a syringe right then and there, draw their blood, and run it through a standard hospital lab, the results would trigger, like, sheer panic.
Yeah.
Half of those incredibly fit people crossing the finish line have levels of heart proteins in their blood that would normally have an emergency room doctor calling a code blue.
It is a profound physiological paradox. I mean, by all traditional clinical metrics, if you look at their blood work, their heart function, and their inflammatory markers in that exact moment, they look like patients experiencing acute cardiac trauma.
And yet they grab a banana, put on a recovery sandal, and walk to their cars. It's wild. So today we are figuring out exactly why that happens, and more importantly, when it actually becomes dangerous. Welcome to the deep dive.
We're so glad you're here.
Yeah, we are speaking directly to you today, the endurance athlete, the trail runner, the marathoner, or maybe you're just someone who is insanely curious about human physiology and, wants to know what happens when you take the human engine and hold the RPMs in the red for 12 hours straight.
Because we are exploring a very specific, very delicate biological tightrope here. On one side of this equation, calculate the volume, the intensity, or especially your recovery, you might be triggering silent, cumulative, and potentially lethal inflammation.
Which is exactly why we are diving into this. We are looking at a stack of cutting-edge clinical data today. We're talking about the groundbreaking 2025 ACCAA, so that's the American College of Cardiology, and the American Heart Association, along with the ESC, the European Society of Cardiology.
Yeah, they recently released entirely new sports cardiology guidelines.
Right. And we also have fresh expert consensus papers, stunning new MRI data on marathon runners, and these longitudinal studies tracking athletes over decades. It's a lot.
It is a lot, and it's important to state our intentions right up front. The goal of this deep dive is absolutely not to scare you away from endurance sports.
No, definitely not.
The data is unequivocal. Physical activity, even extreme physical activity, is fundamentally cardioprotective over your lifespan. Our mission is really just to arm you with the modern science.
We want to empower you to train smarter, to recognize the actual clinical red flags, as opposed to just the benign side effects of training, and to truly understand the underlying biology of modern sports cardiology. Benign side effects of training, and to truly understand the underlying biology of modern sports cardiology.
Exactly. So think of this as your masterclass. We're going to love together the perspectives of a clinical sports cardiologist, a sports dietitian, and an elite endurance coach.
All rolled into one conversation. But to really grasp this, I feel like we have to start inside the chest cavity of that runner we just watched cross the finish line.
We do. We have to establish what a normal extreme effort actually does to the plumbing and the mechanics of the heart.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because before we can talk about disease, we have to understand the baseline mechanics of extreme mechanical stress.
Right. When you are running 130 kilometers, your heart is enduring chronic volume overload and chronic pressure overload. You are asking a muscle to pump massive, continuous volumes of blood to your working skeletal muscles for half a day without a single rest interval.
It's just a pump. I mean, amazing pump, but it's a pump where the different chambers have very different job descriptions.
That is the critical anatomical distinction. Not all chambers are created equal. The left ventricle, the LV, is the powerhouse.
That's the thick one, right?
Yeah, it is a thick, highly muscular chamber because its job is to pump oxygenated blood through your entire systemic circulation. From your brain all the way down to your toes, it is evolutionarily built to handle immense pressure.
But the right ventricle, the RV, operates under a completely different paradigm.
Because it only has to pump blood right next door to the lungs.
Right, the lungs are literally just inches away.
Precisely. The pulmonary circuit is a low pressure system. Therefore, the right ventricle has much, much thinner walls. It is designed to be a highly compliant volume chamber.
Sort of like a flexible bag?
Think of it more like a flexible bellows than a rigid muscular pressure pump. It can accommodate a lot of blood, but it is not built to push against sustained high resistance for hours on end.
Okay, so during an ultra, when my heart rate is at, say, 150 beats per minute for 10 hours, and I'm shoving gallons and gallons of venous blood back into that thin-walled right ventricle, it's basically getting bombarded.
It is disproportionately vulnerable to the sheer volume of blood returning from your working muscles. There's a fascinating study we reviewed analyzing amateur runners completing a 130-kilometer race.
Oh, right, the one where they did the ultrasounds at the finish line.
Yes, they performed echocardiograms immediately post-race, and they observed a significant acute reduction in right ventricular function. Specifically, they looked at the RV ejection fraction.
Just to clarify, ejection fraction, meaning the percentage of blood the chamber manages to squeeze out with each beat.
Correct. The RV ejection fraction in these runners dropped by an average of 9% immediately after crossing the finish line.
9%. Let's just pause on that. If I'm a sedentary guy, I'm sitting on the couch and I go to my cardiologist and they tell me my heart's pumping capacity just dropped by almost 10%.
I'm assuming they are admitting you to the ICU.
Yeah, exactly.
In a non-athlete, an acute 9% drop in ejection fraction is a massive clinical event. It implies severe pathology, perhaps an infarction or acute heart failure.
But here's the magic of the athletic phenomenon.
Right. In these runners, it is a transient dysfunction. It is temporary fatigue of the cardiac muscle. The researchers tracked these athletes in the days following the event, and they found that this right ventricular depression persisted for about 3 to 5 days post-competition.
But then it recovers.
Yes, then it fully recovered.
Okay, but what about over a lifetime? Because running one ultra is one thing, but what if I do this like 3 times a year for 10 years? Does that transient fatigue eventually become a permanent downgrade?
That is exactly what the ProMagic study sought to answer. They followed marathon runners over 10 years of repetitive, strenuous endurance training and competition.
And what happened after a decade?
The reassuring news is that even after a decade of this extreme mechanical stress, while the athletes experienced those acute drops right after a race, their long-term RV ejection fraction consistently returned to their pre-race baseline levels.
Wow.
In the vast majority of athletes, the right ventricle did not permanently deteriorate.
So that bounce back, that recovery, that's what we talk about when we mention the athlete's heart. The heart is actually adapting to handle the load better next time.
Yes, endurance training induces physiological structural remodeling. The heart literally changes its architecture. You develop increased left ventricular end diastolic volume.
Meaning the main chamber stretches slightly to hold a larger volume of blood.
Exactly. You get an increased stroke volume, so you pump more blood per beat, and you develop what we call eccentric and concentric hypertrophy.
Let's break those down, because hypertrophy just means growth, right? Like lifting weights makes your biceps hypertrophy.
Right, muscle growth. Eccentric hypertrophy means the chamber itself expands outward, increasing its internal capacity. Concentric hypertrophy means the actual muscular walls get slightly thicker to generate more force.
So you get a bigger tank and a stronger pump.
In a healthy endurance athlete, you get a beautiful balance of both. The chamber gets bigger, the walls get slightly thicker, but the actual squeezing power, the systolic performance, remains perfectly intact or even improves. That is benign, incredible physiological adaptation.
But the tightrope, we mentioned the tightrope earlier. When does this incredible, beautiful adaptation cross the line and become maladaptive?
This is where modern imaging has completely disrupted our understanding. We looked at a major 2020 meta-analysis that involved over 1,300 participants. They weren't just looking at the pumping function, they were looking for actual myocardial fibrosis.
Scar tissue inside the heart muscle.
Yes, scar tissue. They used a specialized magnetic resonance imaging technique called late gadolinium enhancement, or LGE, which specifically lights up fibrotic scar tissue.
And what did they find in the endurance athletes compared to normal people?
They found that 21.1% of the endurance athletes had detectable scar tissue on their hearts, compared to just 3.2% in the sedentary control group.
Wait, hold on. 1 in 5 elite endurance athletes, people who we assume have the healthiest cardiovascular systems on the planet, have actual permanent scar tissue on their hearts.
It is a staggering statistic, and it highlights the double-edged sword of extreme endurance exercise. Now, we have to look at where that scar tissue is forming. It is not random.
Okay, where is it?
The vast majority of this fibrosis in athletes is localized to very specific areas called the right ventricular insertion points.
What exactly is an insertion point?
Think of the anatomy. You have the thick muscular left ventricle, and the thin-walled right ventricle is essentially attached to the side of it. The insertion points are the hinges, the exact structural seams where the thin RV attaches to the thick LV.
Okay, I want to try an analogy here to see if I'm getting the physics of this right. Let's think of the heart like a really thick, heavy-duty elastic band.
Okay, I like that.
If you take that band and stretch it to its absolute limit for 12 hours during a race, you might get some microscopic micro tears in the rubber, specifically at the spots where you are gripping it in the hinges. But if you put the elastic band down and let it rest, the rubber repairs itself and it snaps back even stronger. That's the normal adaptation.
Yes, perfectly stated.
But are we saying that if you stretch it for 15 hours a week, every week for 20 years and you never give it enough time to fully rest, the rubber permanently loses its snap and those micro tears get replaced by rigid scar tissue.
That is a phenomenal way to visualize it. Moderate exercise and even extreme exercise with adequate rest maintains the equilibrium of that elastic band. The microscopic damage is cleared and repaired.
But if you just keep pulling,
Excessive chronic volume and pressure overload, especially when you stack high-intensity sessions back-to-back without recovery, triggers a chronic inflammatory cascade.
what does that cascade actually look like at a cellular level, though?
Your body senses that those hinge points are under constant structural threat. So fibroblasts, which are the cells in your body responsible for building structural scaffolding, they get activated.
They act like the repair crew.
Exactly. They say, this hinge is going to tear if we don't reinforce it. So they start laying down collagen at the insertion points to stabilize the structure.
Like pouring concrete over a fraying rope.
That's exactly it. But collagen is not muscle. It doesn't stretch and it doesn't contract. It is rigid. Over time, that constant collagen deposition becomes irreversible myocardial fibrosis. You've traded elasticity and function for rigid stability.
So, practically speaking, for someone who is in the middle of a massive training block right now, how do they protect their right ventricle from turning into concrete?
The primary actionable recommendation here revolves entirely around the recovery window. We know definitively that the right ventricle is in a state of transient dysfunction and extreme vulnerability for 3 to 5 days following a major endurance event, or even a massive overloaded training weekend.
Right, that 3 to 5 day window is critical.
To prevent that temporary elastic stretch from evolving into maladaptive scar tissue, you absolutely must ensure adequate low-intensity recovery during that specific window.
So you can't run a 50K trail race on Saturday, take Sunday off, and then show up to the track on Tuesday for a threshold interval session.
That is the exact recipe for myocardial fibrosis. On Tuesday, your right ventricle is still mechanically depressed. Pushing it into high-pressure overload while it is still recovering is what signals those fibroblasts to start laying down scar tissue.
You have to treat that recovery window with the exact same strict, unyielding discipline as your peak training blocks.
Absolutely.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah.
But that raises a massive question about how we actually measure this stress. Because if I'm an athlete or a coach, I can't just cut a runner's chest open to see if their right ventricle is tired.
No, thankfully not.
Right, so we have to rely on blood panels. And this is where I think athletes get incredibly confused or frankly unnecessarily panicked because they look at their blood work through the lens of a sick person, not an athlete.
That happens constantly. Athletes will order comprehensive lab panels, see bold red numbers indicating they are outside the standard medical reference ranges, and assume their heart is failing. We have to decode these biomarkers within the specific context of extreme mechanical stress.
Let's start with the most terrifying one. High sensitivity troponin, the HSCTNI or HSCTNT marker. I know from watching pretty much any medical drama on television that if an ER doctor yells, his troponin is elevated, it means the patient is actively having a massive heart attack, full stop.
Right, that's the classic TV trope.
But looking at the clinical data here, troponin spikes in over 50% of athletes after a marathon. Some of them have levels that exceed the clinical threshold for acute myocardial necrosis. Are half the people crossing the finish line actively suffering a heart attack?
It sounds alarming, but no, they are absolutely not. To understand why, we have to look at the cellular biology of a cardiomyocyte, a heart muscle cell.
Okay, take us inside the cell.
Troponin is a protein complex that lives inside the cell. It sits on the muscle filaments and regulates how the heart muscle contracts. In a true heart attack, a myocardial infarction, a plaque ruptures and blocks an artery. The heart tissue is entirely deprived of oxygen.
So the cells basically suffocate.
Yes. The cardiomyocytes suffocate and undergo necrosis. They literally die, their cell walls rupture, and they violently dump their entire cellular contents, including all their troponin, into the bloodstream. That is a catastrophic event.
And what is happening in the marathon runner? Because they obviously aren't having a blockage.
In the runner, the mechanism is entirely different. It is about membrane permeability, not cell death. Think back to that mechanical stretch we just talked about. As the heart pumps massive volumes of blood for 4 hours, the cell membranes of the cardiomyocytes are stretched.
The physical integrity of the cell wall gets slightly compromised.
Exactly, it becomes leaky.
Like a water balloon that you squeeze so hard, water starts weeping through the microscopic pores of the rubber, even though the balloon hasn't popped.
That is a perfect analogy. Inside the cell, in the fluid called the cytosol, there is a small, free-floating pool of troponin. Under extreme stretch, that cytosolic troponin simply seeps out through the stretched, leaky cell membrane into the bloodstream.
The cell is perfectly alive.
It is perfectly alive. It hasn't ruptured, it's just weeping protein due to mechanical strain.
Okay, that makes it so much less terrifying. But if I'm a doctor looking at the blood test, how do I know if the troponin is from a leaky, healthy cell or a dead necrotic cell? I mean, it's the exact same protein in the blood.
The clinical differentiator is the kinetics, the timeline of how the protein behaves in the blood. Because the runner cells are just temporarily leaky, that benign exercise-induced troponin clears from the bloodstream very, very rapidly.
Rapidly.
Usually within 24 to 48 hours, the levels drop dramatically back to baseline. In a true heart attack, because the tissue is dead and continuously breaking down, the troponin levels stay highly elevated for many days, sometimes weeks.
Okay, got it. Timeline is everything. Let's look at another one. NT-proBNP. This is another marker that endurance athletes might see flagged on a deep dive health panel.
NT-proBNP is a fascinating peptide. It is released specifically in response to ventricular wall tension and volume stretch. It is essentially the heart's chemical signaling system screaming, hey, there's too much volume and pressure in this chamber.
So it's basically a stretch alarm.
Exactly. It peaks immediately post-competition. And the clinical data notes that the magnitude of the NT-proBNP elevation correlates directly with the severity of that transient right ventricular dysfunction we discussed. The more the RV stretches, the more NT-proBNP it pumps out.
So troponin measures the physical leakiness of the cell walls, and NT-proBNP measures the overall stretch and tension of the entire chamber. What about CRP? Because that's a classic inflammation marker.
C-reactive protein, or CRP, is your classic acute phase reactant. It is a marker for systemic body-wide inflammation. Now, in a runner, CRP is tricky. Well, running 100 miles causes profound mechanical damage to your skeletal muscles, your quads, your calves, your hamstrings. That massive muscle breakdown triggers a huge systemic inflammatory cascade, which causes CRP to skyrocket.
So if my CRP is high after a race, it might just mean my legs are trashed, not my heart.
Exactly. However, for a sports cardiologist, tracking CRP during the recovery phase is crucial. If an athlete develops an inflammatory heart issue, or if we suspect maladaptive remodeling is occurring, we use CRP as a gatekeeper.
A gatekeeper for what?
That systemic inflammation must return to a baseline below 3 milligrams per liter before we can even consider clearing an athlete to return to hard training.
Now here is where it gets really interesting for the biohackers out there. The clinical data mentions some newer, highly advanced markers, galectin-3 and SST2. I had never even heard of these before. What are they looking for?
These are the bleeding edge of sports cardiology because they give us a real-time window into the actual fibrotic process, the concrete pouring we talked about earlier.
Oh, wow. So it tracks the scar tissue formation.
Right. Yes. Galectin-3 is a profibrotic biomarker. It is actively secreted by macrophages, which are immune cells. When galectin-3 levels rise in the blood, it is a direct biochemical signal that fibroblasts are actively proliferating and depositing collagen into the heart muscle.
So if troponin is the alarm that the cell is stretched, galectin-3 is the foreman on the construction site actually yelling at the workers to start pouring the concrete scar tissue.
That's a great way to look at it. Studies show it rises sharply during the first half of ultra-endurance races and tightly correlates with acute right ventricular strain. And then you have SST2.
What does that one do?
This is a novel marker that measures mechanical cardiomyocyte strain and volume-induced hypertrophy. Unlike troponin, which drops quickly, SST2 stays elevated from pre-race, peaks mid-race, and notably remains elevated well into the recovery period.
So it lingers.
It does. It is becoming a highly sensitive biochemical tool for monitoring how long active cardiac strain persists after the finish line.
Okay, so all of this biochemical tracking leads to a mind-blowing data point that I pulled from these clinical guidelines. We always have this intuitive assumption that more running, more miles equals more damage to the heart.
Right, the traditional wear and tear model.
Yeah, but the data shows something called the undertrained phenomenon. Can you explain this? Because it seems completely counterintuitive.
It is a brilliant paradox. Researchers categorized runners based on their consistent weekly training volume. They found that athletes running 35 miles a week or less actually exhibited significantly higher post-race troponin and NT-proBNP leaks compared to the high-volume runners who were consistently logging over 45 miles a week.
Wait, so the people running less get more heart damage?
More acute biochemical strain, yes. And it perfectly validates why gradual, consistent volume adaptation is so cardioprotective.
How so?
Well, if you have an undertrained heart, meaning it hasn't structurally adapted to hold more volume, the walls haven't achieved that healthy eccentric hypertrophy, and you throw it into a 4-hour marathon, the mechanical stress is a massive shock to the system.
The balloon isn't stretched out yet.
Exactly. The cell membranes stretch more violently, they leak more troponin, and the chamber walls panic, releasing massive amounts of NT-proBNP.
But the high mileage runner?
The athlete who has consistently put in the high weekly mileage has structurally preconditioned their heart. Their ventricles are more compliant, their cell membranes are more robust, their heart is conditioned to handle the volume overload efficiently, which radically minimizes the acute biochemical injury during the actual race.
Consistency literally builds a better leak-proof cell membrane. It's fascinating. So, for the listener who loves geeking out over their health data and wants to get blood work drawn around a major event, what is the practical takeaway here?
The timing of your blood draw is absolutely everything. If you run a marathon on a Sunday and you march into a lab clinic on Monday morning for a blood test, your troponin, your NT-proBNP, and your CRP will all be blazing red.
And your doctor will completely panic.
Exactly. Elevated troponin immediately post-race is an expected physiological response to extreme endurance.
So when should they test?
You must wait at least 48 to 72 hours. Let the benign exercise-induced leakage clear. If you test on Wednesday or Thursday, and those levels, particularly the troponin, are still persistently elevated, that changes the narrative entirely.
That's the red flag.
Persistent elevation days after the event is no longer a leaky membrane. It is a clinical red flag indicating potential ongoing cellular necrosis or active inflammation, and that requires immediate evaluation by a cardiologist.
Don't panic on Monday. Wait until Thursday. Okay, so up until now, we've established what normal, healthy recovery looks like. We know the cells leak, we know the right ventricle gets tired, and we know it bounces back.
Assuming adequate rest, yes.
Right. But what happens if we take that highly vulnerable, leaky, exhausted heart and we introduce a sudden immune threat, like catching a cold? Let's talk about the massive paradigm shift in the 2025 ESC guidelines.
This is arguably the most critical conceptual transition in modern sports cardiology. To appreciate the shift, you really have to understand the history.
Peter, take us back.
Historically, the medical community treated inflammation of the heart as two distinct, highly compartmentalized diseases based purely on anatomy. You had myocarditis, which is inflammation of the actual myocardium, the heart muscle tissue itself.
And the other one.
And you had pericarditis, which is inflammation of the pericardium, the fibrous protective sac that surrounds the heart.
Right. Muscle inflammation versus sac inflammation. Seems logical enough to separate them.
Anatomically, it is logical, but clinically, in an emergency setting, it created massive problems. Patients rarely present with inflammation neatly confined to just one layer. They present with a mixed clinical picture.
Like what?
They have severe chest pain, maybe a fever, maybe some strange electrical arrhythmias. In the past, doctors would waste critical hours, sometimes days, debating and running tests to figure out, is this primarily myocarditis or is it isolated pericarditis?
And when you were dealing with a highly trained athlete where vigorous exertion with an inflamed heart can trigger a sudden lethal cardiac arrest, you literally don't have time to form a debate club in the ER.
Exactly. The delay in targeted treatment was costing lives. So the 2025 guidelines took a sledgehammer to that old compartmentalized thinking. They introduced a unified diagnostic spectrum called inflammatory myopericardial syndrome, or IMPS.
IMPS.
Yes. IMPS acknowledges the anatomical and pathophysiological reality that the heart muscle and the sac surrounding it act as a single integrated functional unit.
If one is angry, the other is angry.
Precisely. If one is inflamed, the other is almost certainly involved to some degree. By grouping them under the IMPS umbrella, the new guidelines mandate rapid, immediate initiation of anti-inflammatory therapies and immediate exercise restrictions, regardless of which specific tissue layer is slightly more inflamed. It prioritizes rapid action over anatomical pedantry.
I want to dig into how an incredibly fit elite athlete gets IMPS in the first place.
Yeah.
Because the general public perception is that if you run ultramarathons, your immune system must be made of titanium. You never get sick.
That is one of the most dangerous misconceptions in sports science. It is true that moderate daily exercise robustly boosts the immune system, but extreme, high-volume endurance training, pushing your body to the absolute limit for weeks on end, actually creates a severe transient window of systemic immune vulnerability.
This is the open window theory, right?
Precisely. Intensive, prolonged training temporarily but profoundly depletes your mucosal and systemic immune defenses. The physical stress significantly reduces the levels of salivary secretory IgA, it depletes lactoferrin, and it lowers lysozyme levels in your respiratory tract.
So it basically tanks your chemical defenses.
It does. This biochemical cascade effectively downregulates your cellular T-cell response.
So the frontline soldiers of your immune system are basically exhausted and asleep at their posts.
Yes. Suddenly, your primary mucosal defense against airborne respiratory pathogens is completely compromised. This is why endurance athletes in the peak weeks of a training block or immediately following a race are highly susceptible to viral upper respiratory tract infections.
Things like Coxsackie virus, influenza, adenovirus, or COVID-19.
Exactly.
Okay, so the athlete catches a bug, they get a sore throat, some body aches, but they're an athlete, they have a race in 3 weeks. Their entire psychological makeup is built around the concept of pushing through the pain. So they lace up their shoes and go for a run.
And that psychological urge is the fatal error. Training through a viral prodrome, meaning exercising while your body is actively fighting a systemic viral infection, is the most common acquired trigger for IMPS.
Wow.
And consequently, it is the most common acquired cause of sudden cardiac death in young, otherwise healthy, competitive athletes.
Walk me through the biology of why that happens. Why does running with the flu kill you?
When you have a systemic viral infection, the virus is circulating in your bloodstream. It doesn't just stay in your throat or your lungs. If you force your heart to pump at maximum capacity, you are massively increasing the blood flow and thus the delivery of that virus directly into the myocardial tissue.
So you're basically hand delivering the virus to your heart muscle.
Yes. The virus then exhibits direct viral cytotoxicity. It actively invades and kills the heart cells.
But the virus isn't the only problem, is it?
No, the second wave is often much worse. In response to the viral invasion of the heart, your immune system launches a massive, uncoordinated counterattack.
Friendly fire.
Exactly. This immune-mediated inflammatory response is so aggressive that it ends up attacking and destroying your own healthy cardiac tissue alongside the virus. That massive, uncontrolled inflammation is IMPS.
The clinical guidelines outline 3 main diagnostic scenarios for how this actually presents when the athlete finally collapses and goes to the emergency room. What are those 3 scenarios?
The presentation can vary wildly, which is why it's so dangerous. The first scenario is acute chest pain that perfectly mimics acute coronary syndrome, a classic heart attack. The athlete feels a crushing weight on their chest, radiating to the arm or jaw.
Okay, and the second?
The second scenario is new onset acute heart failure. The inflammation is so severe and widespread that the heart muscle becomes incredibly weak and stiff. It simply cannot pump effectively, and the athlete presents with severe shortness of breath and fluid backing up into their lungs.
And the third, I assume it gets worse.
The third, and frankly the most tragic, is when the very first symptom is the onset of severe, life-threatening ventricular arrhythmias, leading to aborted sudden cardiac death during an exercise session.
So they just drop.
Yes. The inflammation disrupts the electrical pathways of the heart, causing it to short circuit and stop beating effectively while the athlete is out on a run.
Okay, that is truly terrifying. So let's bring this down to a practical level for the listener who woke up this morning with a scratchy throat. Everyone gets the sniffles. How does an athlete know when it is just a harmless head cold and when it is a systemic infection that could trigger IMPS?
In sports medicine, we use a modified version of the classic neck up, neck down rule, but with a very specific cardiology twist.
Okay, let's hear the rule.
If your symptoms are strictly above the neck, meaning you have a runny nose, some mild sneezing, a slight scratch in your throat, but your energy levels are completely normal, your resting heart rate is normal, and you have no muscle aches, then light zone 1 training is generally considered safe.
But what is the cardiology twist?
The absolute non-negotiable rule is this: you must never, ever train through systemic symptoms.
Define systemic, just so there is zero ambiguity for anyone listening.
Systemic means the infection has affected your entire body, not just your nasal passages. This includes a fever of any grade. It includes profound, unusual fatigue or brain fog. It includes myalgia, which are deep body aches or joint pain.
What about heart rate?
Crucially, it includes resting tachycardia. If you wake up and your resting heart rate is 10 or 15 beats higher than normal, your autonomic nervous system is fighting a war. And absolutely any exertional chest tightness, palpitations, or shortness of breath that is out of proportion to the effort you are exerting.
If I have any of those, I stop, period.
If you exhibit systemic symptoms, absolute physical rest during that acute viral inflammatory phase is mandatory. There are no shortcuts. You cannot sweat out a systemic virus.
So the big actionable recommendation for your training block is this. Do not mess with systemic symptoms. It is infinitely better to lose 1 week of fitness by sitting on the couch than to lose 6 months of your life or your life entirely to heart inflammation.
I couldn't agree more.
But let's say someone didn't know the rule. They trained through a fever, they developed chest pain, and now they are sitting in a cardiologist's office. How do doctors actually look inside the heart to see if this inflammation or scarring is present without literally cutting the chest open for a biopsy?
This brings us to the incredible advancements in cardiac imaging. The absolute gold standard in contemporary sports cardiology for diagnosing IMPS and structural damage is cardiac magnetic resonance imaging, or CMR.
Why not just use an echocardiogram? Every time I see a sports physical on TV, they use the ultrasound wand on the chest.
An echocardiogram is a fantastic, accessible first-line tool. It uses sound waves to create a picture of the heart's structure. It can show us if the chambers are enlarged, if the valves are leaking, or if there is a large pericardial effusion, which is a dangerous pooling of fluid in the sac around the heart.
But it misses the fine details.
Right. An echo fundamentally looks at gross anatomy. It cannot see the tissue at a cellular molecular level. CMR, on the other hand, provides non-invasive high-resolution tissue characterization.
It can actually see the inflammation inside the muscle wall.
Yes. To make a definitive diagnosis of acute myocarditis using CMR, cardiologists rely on a very specific set of international guidelines known as the updated Lake Louise 2.0 criteria.
Lake Louise. It sounds like a lovely ski resort in Canada, not a diagnostic medical protocol. The guidelines state that to meet the Lake Louise criteria, the scan must show two things: T2-weighted edema and T1-based injury. Can we translate that into plain English? How does a giant magnet see swelling?
Let's break it down to the physics of MRI very simply. MRIs use powerful magnetic fields to interact with the protons in the water molecules inside your body. T2 mapping is a specific sequence programmed into the MRI that is incredibly sensitive to free water.
So it's looking for pooling water.
Exactly. When tissue is acutely inflamed, your immune system floods the area with fluid. This is called hyperemia and myocardial edema. It's exactly like a sprained ankle swelling up, but it's happening inside your heart muscle. The T2 mapping specifically highlights this abnormal pooling of water, proving there is active acute inflammation.
Okay, so T2 looks for the water, the active swelling. What does T1 mapping look for?
T1 mapping, which often utilizes that late gadolinium enhancement we talked about earlier, is looking for non-ischemic myocardial injury. It is looking for the actual destruction of cells, the expansion of the extracellular space, or the presence of irreversible collagen fibrosis.
Wait, how does it see the scar tissue? What is gadolinium?
Gadolinium is a specialized heavy metal contrast dye that we inject into the patient's bloodstream before the scan. In healthy, tightly packed heart muscle, the gadolinium washes in and washes right back out.
Because there's no room for it to stay.
Right. But if there is scar tissue, or if the cells have been destroyed and replaced by a loose network of collagen, the gadolinium gets trapped in those extracellular spaces. When we run the T1 scan, those trapped areas of dye light up brightly.
So you need both pieces of the puzzle.
Yes. To definitively confirm acute myocarditis under the Lake Louise criteria, you need evidence of both: the active swelling shown by T2 and the structural cellular injury shown by T1.
That is an unbelievable level of precision.
Yeah.
Now, hearing how amazing this CMR machine is at spotting microscopic damage, my immediate thought as an athlete is, why shouldn't I just go get one? Why shouldn't every single college and pro athlete get a routine CMR scan at the start of every season just to be safe?
It's a very common question.
The clinical papers mention a massive study called the Big Ten COVID-19 Cardiac Registry that looked at this exact idea of mass screening. What happened?
The Big Ten registry provided a massive wake-up call to the cardiology community about the dangers of overtesting. During the height of the pandemic, many universities mandated CMRs for athletes who had recovered from COVID-19, even if they felt perfectly fine.
The idea was to catch hidden myocarditis, I assume.
Exactly. What they found was that mass screening of asymptomatic athletes can be incredibly counterproductive and psychologically damaging.
How can finding more information be damaging?
Because the CMR is almost too sensitive. In the Big Ten registry, they found that over half of the athletes suspected of having myocarditis based on the MRI had purely subclinical findings.
Meaning they had zero symptoms.
Exactly. They felt perfectly fine. Their ECGs were completely normal. Their blood troponin levels were 0. But the incredibly sensitive CMR picked up some tiny isolated tissue irregularities, perhaps a tiny fleck of late gadolinium enhancement, or a slight localized elevation in T2 signal that was totally asymptomatic.
And what did the doctors do with that information? Did they just ignore it?
No, and that was the problem. Because the finding was on a medical report, doctors felt legally and ethically obligated to act. These isolated microscopic imaging findings led to massive, unnecessary, and prolonged exercise restrictions.
Oh, wow.
Athletes who felt completely healthy were hit with blanket 6-month bans from all physical activity.
A 6-month ban for an elite athlete is devastating. It ruins seasons, it ruins scholarships.
The psychological distress, the severe anxiety, and the physical detraining caused by those bans were profound. The heart is a highly dynamic organ. Small patches of fluid or mild fibrotic remodeling at the insertion points can simply be a normal part of the extreme athletic adaptation process we discussed earlier.
So if you go looking for trouble, you'll find it.
If you go looking into an asymptomatic heart with an electron microscope without a clear clinical reason to be there, you will inevitably find anomalies that terrify you, but that are actually completely benign variants of an athlete's physiology.
Speaking of finding anomalies, the data on fibrosis showed some fascinating differences between male and female athletes. What did the MRIs reveal there?
The gender differences are quite striking and are currently a major area of research. When elite female endurance athletes do show myocardial fibrosis on a CMR, it is generally very minor in scope and localized strictly to those right ventricular insertion points, the hinges we discussed.
It rarely progresses beyond that mechanical stress point.
Correct.
Why are women more protected?
The prevailing hypothesis is that estrogen exerts powerful antifibrotic effects on the cardiac tissue. Estrogen seems to limit the aggressive deposition of collagen by fibroblasts and promotes a more healthy, compliant, adaptive remodeling response to volume overload.
And what do the scans show in men?
Male athletes, particularly older, veteran endurance athletes who have been racing for decades, exhibit a much different pattern. They show significantly more extensive, non-ischemic mid-wall scarring.
So it spreads further.
Yes, it's a diffuse fibrotic pattern that spreads into the main muscular walls of the left ventricle. It is a significantly different, more potentially concerning pattern of wear and tear that we have to monitor closely as male athletes age.
Okay, I want to push back on this diagnostic stuff for a second. Let's step away from the $1 million MRI machines. Let's say a runner goes in for his standard physical, and they get a routine EKG, an electrocardiogram, just the cheap, sticky patches on the chest that mirror the electrical rhythm.
Sure, very standard.
And the doctor looks at the printout and says, your QRS complex is prolonged, or you have sinus bradycardia, your heart rate is only 38. If a runner hears that, should they panic that they have hidden scar tissue short-circuiting their heart?
Absolutely not. This is another classic trap of applying sedentary medical standards to elite athletes. In a highly trained athlete, electrical anomalies on an ECG, when they exist entirely alone without any structural dysfunction, without symptoms, and without a family history of sudden death, almost always just reflect physiological hypertrophy.
Explain that. Why does a big heart change the electricity?
Think about the physics of the electrical signal. The heart beats because an electrical wave travels across the muscle tissue. The QRS complex on an ECG measures the time it takes for that signal to travel through the main ventricles.
Okay, so distance matters.
Right. If your endurance training has caused your heart chambers to dilate and your muscle walls to undergo eccentric hypertrophy, meaning the heart is physically larger, it simply takes the electrical signal a tiny fraction of a millisecond longer to physically travel across that increased mass of tissue.
So a prolonged QRS just means the electricity has to travel a longer distance. Doesn't mean the wire is breaking.
Precisely. And as for sinus bradycardia, having a resting heart rate in the 30s or 40s is a hallmark of elite fitness. It is driven by high vagal tone. Your parasympathetic nervous system is incredibly dominant at rest. Because your stroke volume is so massive, it only needs to beat 40 times a minute to supply your body.
So you can't pathologize standard ECG findings in isolation in a high-level athlete?
You really can't.
So practically speaking, if you are listening to this and mapping out your health strategy, do not seek out routine CMR MRI screening. if you are completely healthy and asymptomatic. More data is not always better data.
It often leads to unnecessary interventions.
Right. Imaging should be strictly reserved for athletes who have clear clinical symptoms, highly abnormal ECGs that flag specific pathological markers, or persistently elevated blood biomarkers. You have to treat the patient, not the scan.
That is the absolute cornerstone of modern sports cardiology.
Okay, let's move into the reality of recovery. Let's look at the worst case scenario. You got a virus, you made a mistake, you trained through it, you developed chest pain, and the MRI confirmed you have IMPS.
Acute myopericarditis.
The scenario we all want to avoid.
Yeah. But let's say you've rested, you've been on the couch, and now your CRP blood markers are finally down, the inflammation's gone. How do you actually get back on the trail without risking sudden cardiac arrest? Because historically, doctors just slapped that 6-month ban on you and said, see you in half a year. That old, archaic, one-size-fits-all 6-month ban has thankfully been abandoned in the 2025 guidelines. The psychological and physical toll of completely detraining an athlete for half a year was immense.
So what's the new standard?
It has been replaced by a highly structured, highly individualized, 4-phase return-to-play protocol. But before you are even allowed to begin phase 1, you have to prove your engine is stable by passing a major clinical checkpoint, the CPE.
Cardiopulmonary exercise testing. This is the classic sports science setup where they put you on a treadmill, wire you up to an EKG, and strap that massive oxygen mask to your face.
Yes, and it is absolutely vital. A resting ECG or a resting echocardiogram cannot replicate the massive catecholaminergic surge, the adrenaline, and the metabolic stress of a trail race. We need to see exactly how your cardiorespiratory circuit functions under maximal load.
What are we actually measuring, though?
We look at 3 main physiological variables during a CPET to determine if your heart is truly recovered from the inflammation.
What's the first variable?
First is VO2 peak. This measures your overall cardiovascular reserve and your maximal oxygen transport capacity. We compare it to your pre-illness baseline if we have it, or to predicted values for your age and fitness level.
And if it's low?
If your VO2 peak has plummeted radically and you struggle to hit even moderate workloads, it strongly suggests your stroke volume has been chronically impaired by the illness and your heart is not ready.
What is the second variable?
Ventilatory efficiency, which is represented by the VE-VCO2 slope. This is arguably the most critical metric on the entire test. It reflects the precise physiological relationship between the volume of air you are breathing in and out, which is VE, and the amount of carbon dioxide your body is producing and expelling, which is VCO2.
I saw the clinical data that if this slope is greater than 30, it is a massive red flag. Can you explain why using an analogy? Because the math of ventilation perfusion mismatching is, well, really dense.
Let's visualize it. Think of your lungs and your heart as a factory assembly line. The lungs are the loading dock. They bring in the oxygen and they pack up the carbon dioxide waste. The heart is the conveyor belt that constantly moves the blood to and from the loading dock.
Okay, heart is the conveyor belt.
Got it. If the heart is still recovering from inflammation and is pumping weakly, the conveyor belt slows down. The blood isn't moving through the lungs efficiently.
So the lungs have to work overtime to compensate.
Exactly. Because the conveyor belt is sluggish, carbon dioxide starts backing up. To clear it, your lungs start hyperventilating. You have to breathe twice as much air to clear the same amount of CO2.
That inefficiency drives the VE-CO2 slope up.
Yes. If a cardiologist sees a slope over 30, it proves there is severe pulmonary ventilation perfusion mismatching. It is an early sign of exercise-induced heart failure or lingering pulmonary congestion. If your slope is over 30, it is a hard absolute stop. You are not cleared to begin training.
Wow. Okay. The factory conveyor belt is broken. What is the third CPITted variable?
The O2 pulse. This is a very elegant metric calculated by simply dividing your VO2, your oxygen consumption, by your heart rate at any given moment. It serves as a direct, non-invasive clinical surrogate for your stroke volume mechanics.
How should it look on a graph?
In a healthy, recovered athlete, the O2 pulse should follow a smooth, steady, upward trajectory as the treadmill gets faster and steeper.
Because the heart is expanding and pumping more blood with each beat as the demand goes up.
Right. But if the O2 pulse prematurely plateaus, or worse, if it suddenly drops while you are still running, it means your heart chamber has physically hit a wall. It cannot expand or fill properly.
Why wouldn't it fill?
This is often due to lingering muscular stiffness from the inflammation, or pericardial constriction, meaning the sac around the heart is still tight and scarred, preventing the ventricle from opening up.
Okay, so let's say you pass a CPE. Your slope is under 30. Your O2 pulse climbs beautifully. Your VO2 peak is solid. Now we get to the actual return to play protocol.
Yeah.
I love this part of the new guidelines because it finally gives athletes a concrete, actionable roadmap instead of just go rest. Let's role play this timeline.
It begins with the pre-clearance phase. Before you even think about putting on running shoes, you must be completely symptom-free at rest for at least one full rest. Your CRP blood test must be completely normal, under 3 milligrams per liter, and you need a normal resting ECG.
Once you check those baseline boxes, you enter phase 1.
Correct.
Phase 1, the duration is 2 weeks. The strict clinical rule is that your heart rate is capped at 50 to 60% of your maximum heart rate. For an elite ultra runner, 50% of their max HR is literally a brisk walk to the mailbox.
It is a walk or perhaps a very, very light zero-resistance cycling on a stationary trainer. The non-negotiable strict clinical rule for phase 1 is absolutely NO sweating and absolutely NO shortness of breath.
No sweating for 2 weeks? I mean, if I'm an ultra runner, I sweat when I tie my shoes. That sounds like psychological torture.
It is an immense psychological test of discipline, but remember, the goal of phase 1 is not to build fitness. The goal is simply to reintroduce basal movement and assess how the myocardium handles the absolute lowest level of metabolic stress without triggering an inflammatory relapse.
Okay, I survived 2 weeks of aggressive walking. I don't sweat. I moved to phase 2. The duration is another 2 weeks. The heart rate cap moves up to 70% of my max.
In phase 2, you are allowed to begin flat, highly structured running, no hills. But the volume is strictly capped at 45 to 60 minutes maximum per session.
And what am I watching for?
During this phase, the athlete must rigorously and honestly monitor for any exertional chest tightness, any skipped beats or palpitations, or unusual fatigue.
Phase 3. The duration is 2 to 4 weeks. The heart rate cap jumps to 85% of max. This is where the leash finally comes off a bit. Now we are talking about actual interval running, moderate hill climbs, and pushing into multi-hour endurance sessions. You finally feel like an athlete again.
Yes, the intensity increases significantly, but the medical oversight remains tight. During phase 3, cardiologists will often assess serial inflammatory markers, meaning they will draw your blood and check your CRP at the end of each training week to ensure that this new heavy workload isn't silently causing a relapse of the IMPS.
And finally, phase 4. Full competitive clearance, uncapped heart rate, 100% effort, sprints, races, whatever you want. But this final freedom is entirely contingent on one last hurdle.
Correct. Before you are fully released into phase 4, you must complete one final maximal effort CPET. You must run to absolute exhaustion on the treadmill, and the ECG must demonstrate absolutely zero exercise-induced ventricular arrhythmias under peak catecholaminergic stress. If you pass that, you're cleared.
So, listening to this progression, the most important practical takeaway is discipline. Athletes are notoriously terrible at judging their own perceived exertion. When you are returning from an injury, you have all these pent-up endorphins, and running at a 150 heart rate feels incredibly easy, till suddenly it's not.
It's very easy to overdo it.
Right. If you are returning from IMPS, or frankly, any significant viral illness, you cannot rely on how you feel. You must use a chest strap heart rate monitor to definitively, mathematically cap your recovery runs at those exact 60, 70, and 85% thresholds.
It is the only safe path forward. You can negotiate with a sore hamstring, but you cannot negotiate with myocardial inflammation.
Let's pivot to the chemistry of all this. We've mapped out the physical recovery timeline. But what about pharmacological strategies, supplements, and the major mistakes people make when trying to speed this process up? If someone is diagnosed with IMPS, what is the actual medication protocol they are going to be prescribed?
The standard, evidence-based first-line therapy for acute IMPS involves immediate training cessation, coupled with a very specific drug regimen. Cardiologists will prescribe high doses of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, NSAIDs, like high-dose ibuprofen or high-dose aspirin.
And there's an add-on, right?
Crucially, this is combined with a targeted anti-inflammatory drug called colchicine.
Colchicine, I've heard of that for gout.
Yes, it is incredibly effective at halting the specific inflammatory pathways involved. Yes, it is incredibly effective at halting the specific inflammatory pathways involved in pericarditis and myocarditis. It is typically dosed at 0.5 milligrams twice daily. And because the NSAI doses are so high, the protocol mandates adding a PPI, a proton pump inhibitor, to protect the patient's stomach lining from developing severe gastric ulcers during the treatment.
I have to mention a really funny but terrifying note I found in the clinical papers regarding this exact medication protocol. There was an AI-generated case study that was submitted to a medical journal about treating a runner with myopericarditis.
Oh, I remember reading about this.
Yeah, the human expert who reviewed the AI's work pointed out that the AI had hallucinated and actually prescribed the completely wrong, potentially toxic dosage of colchicine in its written treatment plan. It would have severely harmed the patient.
It's a huge warning sign.
It's a great reminder that while AI is amazing at summarizing data,
Yep.
you desperately need real, experienced human clinical judgment when you are dosing heart medications.
Absolutely. The nuances of pharmacology, especially balancing clearance rates and toxicity in athletes who have different metabolic rates than the general public, require precise human expertise.
Speaking of things athletes love to self-prescribe, let's talk about supplements. The endurance world is an absolute circus of unregulated powders, pills, and magic recovery potions. But today, we are sticking strictly to the evidence-based clinical sports cardiology data.
Let's stick to the science.
Let's look at the two supplements specifically highlighted in the consensus papers. Let's start with omega-3 fatty acids. Fish oil. Every athlete takes it for joint inflammation. Does it help the heart?
The evidence on omega-3s in sports cardiology is highly nuanced, and athletes really need to pay close attention here. Low doses of omega-3, meaning 1.0 gram per day or less, have strong, proven clinical evidence for safety. At this dose, it supports general cardiovascular health, improves lipid profiles, and mildly reduces baseline systemic inflammation.
When I hear a but coming.
But high-dose regimens athletes taking 3, 4, or 5 grams a day carry limited to no recommended evidence. In fact, high doses must be approached with extreme caution. Recent large-scale randomized trials have shown that megadosing omega-3s can significantly increase the risk of developing atrial fibrillation.
AFib, an electrical arrhythmia in the upper chambers of the heart. Why does fish oil cause that?
It's a paradox we're still unraveling. Omega-3s incorporate themselves into the cell membranes. At very high concentrations, they may alter the electrical conductivity of the ion channels in the atrial tissue.
And why is that bad for runners?
This is incredibly problematic because endurance athletes, simply by virtue of their years of training, already possess a slightly elevated baseline risk for developing AFib due to atrial dilation and high vagal tone.
Wow. So an athlete pounding down 4 grams of liquid fish oil every morning, thinking they are just biohacking their knee pain and saying more is better, might actually be actively setting the stage for an electrical storm in their heart.
Exactly. You are taking a heart that is already electrically primed for AFib due to training, and you are bathing it in high-dose lipids that further destabilize the atrial rhythm.
That is a massive realization. What about the other supplement mentioned in the clinical sources, CoQ10?
Coenzyme Q10 has solid, moderate evidence supporting its use in endurance populations. CoQ10 is vital for mitochondrial function, the energy factories inside the heart cells.
Does it help with recovery?
Studies show that supplementing with it may help reduce specific cardiac stress markers after intense exercise by supporting the metabolic efficiency of the myocardium. It is generally considered highly safe and potentially beneficial for athletes managing massive weekly training loads.
So, practically speaking, for your supplement cabinet, do not fall into the trap of blindly megadosing. Avoid taking more than 1.0 gram of omega-3 fish oil a day unless you are being directly monitored by a cardiologist who is running regular ECGs to watch for atrial fibrillation.
Stick to targeted, proven interventions and realize that more is not always better.
Less is very often more when it comes to biochemically supplementing an already highly tuned, complex physiological system.
Exactly right.
Okay, we have covered an immense amount of scientific ground today. We've gone from the flexible bellows of the right ventricle to the mechanics of leaky cell membranes dropping troponin, to the viral triggers of IMPS, the water-seeking magnets of Lake Louise MRIs, the factory floor failure of a high VCO2 slope, and the dangers of overdosing fish oil. It's a lot to digest.
It is a deep dive for sure.
Let's bring this entire masterclass together.
I think the best way to synthesize this is to distill it down to the absolute core principles, the foundational truths of modern sports cardiology.
Let's do it. When I look at this whole landscape, the biggest thing that stands out to me is the anatomy itself. The right ventricle really is the crux of the issue. It is the most vulnerable chamber during ultra-endurance events.
Yes, because it's thin-walled and designed for low pressure, the massive volume overload of a long race makes it highly susceptible to transient dysfunction and mechanical stretch. You have to respect that chamber.
And following that mechanical stretch is the biochemical reality. Troponin leaks are a normal physiological phenomenon immediately post-race. It reflects benign membrane permeability, not cell death.
However, the timeline is everything. Persistent elevation 48 to 72 hours later is a severe clinical red flag that requires immediate evaluation.
Then there's the undertrained phenomenon, which I still find fascinating. Gradual volume adaptation, putting in the boring, consistent weekly mileage over months and years, actually protects the heart from acute injury.
It physically conditions the walls and membranes to handle the stress, resulting in lower biomarker leaks than someone who runs low mileage.
On the clinical side, the most important diagnostic takeaway is IMPS, inflammatory myopericardial syndrome. It is the new standard in the 2025 guidelines.
We now treat myocardial muscle inflammation and pericardial sac inflammation as a unified, integrated spectrum to ensure rapid, aggressive, anti-inflammatory treatment without delaying care.
And the trigger for IMPS is almost always behavioral. The neck up, neck down rule. You must never, ever train through systemic viral symptoms like a fever, severe unusual fatigue, or resting tachycardia.
Forcing an infected heart to pump at max capacity is the #1 trigger for dangerous heart inflammation and sudden cardiac death in athletes.
If you do experience issues, remember that routine MRI screening for asymptomatic athletes causes far more harm, detraining, and psychological anxiety than good.
Advanced imaging like CMR should be strictly reserved for athletes with clinical symptoms, abnormal ECGs, or elevated biomarkers. We do not treat subclinical ghosts.
But if you do get diagnosed, the return to play is no longer a lazy 6-month ban. It is a highly structured, 4-phase, heart rate capped progression. It requires strict adherence, patience, and absolute honesty with your heart rate monitor.
And that return is gated by the CPA. A VEV-CO2 slope greater than 30 during a cardiopulmonary exercise test is a hard stop. It indicates pulmonary congestion and poor cardiac pumping efficiency, proving the heart is not ready for the demands of training.
On the supplement front, the evidence is clear. Keep your omega-3 supplementation to 1.0 gram or less per day to protect your heart's electrical system from the increased risk of atrial fibrillation.
Which all leads to the ultimate conclusion. True athletic longevity requires treating your recovery periods with the exact same discipline, focus, and respect as your peak training blocks.
That is an incredible synthesis. Before we sign off, I want to ask you about the future. We've talked about where sports cardiology is right now in 2025 and 2026, but what is coming next? What is the provocative idea that is going to change this entirely?
Think about how rapidly imaging technology and artificial intelligence are merging. The clinical sources are already hinting at the development of virtual native enhancement, or VNE, combined with deep learning AI.
What does that actually look like?
We are moving toward a near future where we won't need to inject heavy metal contrast dyes like gadolinium to see scar tissue. Imagine a world just a few years from now where you could step into a scanner for 10 minutes and an AI instantly analyzes your native T1 and T2 mapping without any dye.
Wow, so it's completely non-invasive.
Exactly. It could instantly tell you the exact biological age of your heart, quantify every microscopic bit of fibrotic wear and tear you've accumulated over your career, and perfectly tailor your exact training load and recovery needs for that specific day.
A completely transparent, high-definition view of the engine in real time.
It will completely eliminate the guesswork of, am I recovered enough? But until that technology is sitting in every local sports clinic, we have to rely on the signals our biology is sending us right now.
We have to pay attention.
You have to listen to your body, respect your systemic symptoms, and honor your recovery needs, not just blindly follow the arbitrary fitness algorithms on your smartwatch.
It all comes back to respecting the machine. You know, we started this deep dive talking about the finish line of an ultra and the chaos happening in the blood of those runners. And while the human heart under extreme stress might still feel infinitely more complex than a simple broken bone on an X-ray, I think today we've managed to decode a lot of the mystery.
We finally have the sophisticated tools, the precise biomarkers, and the unified guidelines to navigate these extreme physiological waters safely.
We absolutely do. To everyone listening, whether you are logging massive miles on the mountain trails, pounding the pavement in the city, or you are just deeply fascinated by the limits of human potential, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Train smart, listen to the engine, respect the recovery, and we'll see you next time. We are constantly told, almost every day, that exercise is the ultimate medicine.
Oh, absolutely. It's the universal prescription.
Right. It's like the silver bullet for longevity, the cure for almost everything that ails the modern human body. But what happens when you take that medicine and you multiply the dose by 10?
That is where things get complicated. Very complicated.
Yeah, so picture this. Picture an athlete crossing the finish line of a 100-mile mountain race. I mean, they're lean, their resting heart rate is probably in the 30s, and outwardly, they look like the absolute pinnacle of human fitness.
They look invincible.
Exactly. But if you could look inside their chest at the exact moment, the machinery might be telling a very, very different and honestly a much more alarming story. So welcome to this deep dive.
It's great to be here to unpack this.
For you, the learner listening, whether you're an avid runner lacing up your shoes right now, or maybe a weekend warrior, or just intensely curious about the absolute limits of human physiology, our mission today is to explore this incredibly fine line, the line between healthy physiological adaptation and, well, irreversible cardiac damage.
It's a really profound paradox, right? Because we're looking at a population that has optimized every outward metric of health, but underneath the surface, they might be harboring structural and electrical damage that basically rivals what we see in chronic disease states.
Which is terrifying.
Yeah, the boundary between a light performance and pathology is just much thinner than we ever realized.
We have a truly fascinating stack of sources to guide us through this today. We're pulling from clinical reviews, sports cardiology journals, the landmark Master at Heart study, and some very eye-opening research on cardiac biomarkers.
The biomarker data is just mind-blowing.
It really is. And as I was going through these papers trying to conceptualize what this level of exertion actually does to the body, I just kept coming back to a mechanical comparison, like a car engine.
I like that analogy.
Right. So if moderate exercise is like cruising on the highway, keeping the car at a steady 65 miles per hour, which is great for fuel efficiency and keeps the engine running cleanly.
Sure, it's optimal.
But ultra endurance running, that is like keeping the tachometer in the red zone for 15 hours straight. At some point, I don't care how well built that engine is, the parts are going to start to wear out.
That engine analogy actually translates perfectly to the myocardium, the heart muscle. I mean, the human heart has this astonishing capacity to remodel itself in response to load, but it is still bound by physical mechanical limits.
It's still flesh and blood.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When you peg that tachometer, you are subjecting the tissue to forces it fundamentally just wasn't designed to sustain indefinitely.
Okay, before we get into the whole breakdown of that engine, let's establish the baseline here, because our sources make it abundantly clear that regular physical activity is profoundly beneficial.
Oh, without a doubt. We don't want people taking away the wrong message.
Right. We're looking at consistent data showing that standard exercise lowers systolic blood pressure by like 2 to 5 millimeters of mercury. It optimizes your lipid profile, improves LDL and HDL cholesterol ratios, drastically improves insulin sensitivity.
Which heavily reduces the risk of type 2 diabetes.
Yes. And perhaps most impressively, it can increase overall life expectancy by up to 7 years.
The cardiovascular benefits of going from a sedentary lifestyle to an active one, they're undeniable. It improves endothelial function, which means your blood vessels can dilate more effectively, and it reduces systemic inflammation over the long term.
So the literature is unanimous on this point.
Completely unanimous. However, the data becomes incredibly nuanced when we look at the extreme end of the volume spectrum, because the mortality benefits, they do not scale linearly.
They form a U-shaped curve.
Exactly, a U-shaped curve.
I really want to look closely at that U-shaped curve because, our audience knows that in epidemiology, a U-shape usually implies a sweet spot in the middle and then diminishing returns or even active harm at the extremes. How did researchers quantify where that drop-off actually happens?
Well, there was this massive 15-year observational study that tracked about 52,000 adults. And the researchers basically wanted to find the exact parameters of that sweet spot you mentioned.
Okay, 52,000 is a huge sample size. What did they find?
The data revealed that the maximum longevity benefit, which was a 19% reduction in all-cause mortality, was achieved by running between just 1 and 20 miles per week.
Wait, 1 to 20 total for the whole week?
Yep, at speeds of roughly 6 to 7 miles per hour, distributed across maybe 2 to 5 days a week.
That is very accessible volume. I mean, we're talking about maybe 3 or 4 miles a few days a week at a moderate conversational pace.
Which aligns perfectly with standard public health guidelines. But the critical finding of this 15-year study emerged when they analyzed the cohorts exceeding those numbers.
Here we go.
Right. Individuals running higher weekly mileages at much faster paces and training more frequently than those moderate parameters, they actually began to lose that survival advantage.
They lost it completely.
The mortality curve swung back up. It completely negated that 19% benefit, essentially bringing their statistical risk closer to the baseline of individuals who were completely sedentary.
That's wild. So the people dedicating their entire lives to running 60, 70, or 80 miles a week were statistically losing the cardiovascular longevity benefits that a casual jogger was getting.
Yes. But, epidemiological data can sometimes be confounded by lifestyle factors.
Right, like maybe extreme runners eat differently or sleep less, who knows? But the sources point to an animal study from the Mayo Clinic proceedings that isolates this phenomenon in a completely controlled environment.
Animal models are crucial here because they strip away those human variables of diet, genetics, and lifestyle choices. In this specific study, researchers utilized an exercise model with rats.
And what did they do to the rats?
They compelled them to run strenuously on treadmills for 60 minutes a day, every single day, for 16 weeks.
Let's contextualize that for the listener, because an hour of running for a human is just a standard Tuesday workout. But for a rat, given their metabolic rate and their typical behavioral patterns, 60 minutes of forced, strenuous running daily for 16 weeks, that's an immense physiological load.
It's basically an ultra-endurance equivalent. It represents a chronic, extreme volume overload for their little cardiovascular systems.
So what happened to their hearts?
The researchers evaluated the structural and electrical changes, and they observed marked hypertrophy enlargement of both the right ventricle and the left ventricle.
The heart just swelled up.
Yes. Furthermore, the rats developed diastolic dysfunction. This means the heart muscle was stiffening and failing to relax and fill with blood properly between beats. They also noted significant dilation of the atria, the upper chambers.
So the physical architecture of the heart is warping under the stress. But it was the electrical consequences that really stood out in the text to me. What happened when they tested the heart rhythms?
The electrophysiological findings were definitely the most alarming part. The researchers attempted to induce arrhythmias in these rats.
Like trying to trigger a bad heartbeat.
Right. In the sedentary control group of rats, they could only induce ventricular tachycardia, which is a dangerous, rapid heart rhythm that can lead to sudden cardiac death in about 6% of the animals.
Okay, 6%. What about the runners?
In the exercise-trained rats, that number skyrocketed. 42% of the endurance-trained rats had inducible ventricular tachycardia.
42%. That is a massive escalation in risk. But this is where I actually need to push back a little on the fatalism of this U-shaped curve.
Okay, let's hear it.
Because the study didn't end there. The sources clearly state that the researchers then gave these rats 8 weeks of complete rest. And crucially, the fibrosis, the structural scarring that had developed in the heart tissue, largely regressed.
Yes, it did.
The heart's essentially healed. So if the damage is reversible, doesn't that just mean the heart is acting like any other normal skeletal muscle? You go to the gym, you tear down your biceps, they get inflamed, you rest, and they recover stronger. Why are we sounding the alarm about a U-shaped curve if this is just a reversible adaptation?
That right there is the central debate surrounding this whole concept of the athlete's heart. Historically, sports cardiologists viewed these changes of the enlarged ventricular volumes, the increased cardiac mass, as entirely benign physiological adaptations.
Right, the heart's a muscle, it gets bigger.
Exactly. The assumption was exactly what you just described. But comparing the myocardium to a skeletal muscle like your bicep overlooks a fundamental biological reality. You can rest your bicep for a week. The heart, it beats roughly 100,000 times a day, every single day.
Never gets a day off.
Never. It's operating under constant load, even at rest. Furthermore, skeletal muscle is specifically designed to undergo cycles of macroscopic damage and repair. It is rich with satellite cells that facilitate rapid regeneration.
And the heart doesn't have those.
The myocardium does not have that same regenerative capacity. What this animal study suggests, and what we are increasingly seeing in the human data, is that there is a definitive tipping point where physiological adaptation transitions into pathological remodeling.
So the rest period is the catch.
Yes. While the rats showed regression of fibrosis after 8 weeks of absolute rest, human ultra-endurance athletes do not take 8 weeks of absolute rest. They recover for a few days, and then they're right back out there logging miles. The compounding mechanical stress outpaces the tissue's ability to repair itself.
Wow. Okay, to really understand why that compounding stress doesn't just bounce back like a sore bicep, I think we need to look at what is actively happening at the cellular level during the event itself. Like, what is actually spilling into the bloodstream the moment a runner crosses the finish line?
This brings us to the acute myocardial stress phase, the immediate aftermath of extreme exertion.
The sources detail the sheer physical trauma of mountain ultramarathons, and it's just staggering. We're talking about races like a 105-kilometer course with 5,600 meters of elevation gain.
The amount of eccentric muscular loading involved in running downhill for that long is just brutal.
Can you explain eccentric loading for us?
Eccentric loading is a unique type of mechanical stress. It occurs when a muscle is forcibly lengthened while it is simultaneously trying to contract and absorb impact.
Like using your legs as brakes.
Precisely. When you run downhill, your quadriceps are acting as brakes. This eccentric force literally shears the microscopic contractile units of the muscle, the sarcomeres, tearing them apart. It's profoundly more damaging to the muscle fibers than concentric loading, which is simply contracting the muscle to push yourself upward.
And when those muscle cells tear open from the braking, their internal contents just spill directly into the bloodstream. I was looking at the study comparing standard distance triathletes to ultra distance triathletes, and the biomarker avalanche is incredible. Can you walk us through the actual lab values they recorded?
The magnitude of the cellular leakage is extraordinary. The researchers measured creatine kinase, or CK, which is a classic biomarker for skeletal muscle damage.
Okay, what were the numbers?
In the ultra-distance triathletes, their CK levels surged from a baseline of approximately 189 milligrams per deciliter all the way up to around 11,128.
Oh my gosh,
Okay.
which is an enormous spike,
Yeah.
indicating massive systemic muscle breakdown.
They also measured myoglobin, which is an oxygen-binding protein found in muscle tissue. The ultra-athletes saw their myoglobin jump from a baseline of roughly 38 micrograms per liter to an astonishing 1,467.
That's insane. The skeletal muscles are essentially dissolving under the mechanical strain and just weeping protein into the plasma.
Exactly.
But, the skeletal muscle markers are kind of expected, right?
Yeah.
Your legs are supposed to be destroyed after a 100-mile race. It's the cardiac-specific markers that are the real red flags in this research.
That is where the clinical picture becomes highly concerning. To assess myocardial damage, we look at high-sensitivity cardiac troponin T, or HSCTNT. Troponin is a regulatory protein integral to heart muscle contraction.
And what did they find there?
In these ultra athletes, troponin levels peak dramatically about 3 to 10 hours post-exertion. We also measure a peptide called NT-proBNP.
Okay, what does NT-proBNP actually measure in this context?
NT-proBNP is a biomarker of ventricular stretch and wall tension. When the chambers of the heart are subjected to excessive volume or pressure, the cardiac cells secrete this peptide in an attempt to regulate blood pressure and fluid balance.
So it's basically a gauge of how stretched out the heart is getting.
It is a direct indicator of how badly the walls of the heart are being ballooned outward. In the ultra-distance triathletes, NT-proBNP levels escalated from a baseline of about 41 nanograms per liter to 11,190.
Wait, from 41 to over 1,100.
Yes.
So we are looking at almost a 30-fold increase in the marker for heart wall stretching.
In addition to the troponin and NT-proBNP, the research highlights massive spikes in markers like galectin-3 and soluble ST2.
Why are those specific markers a problem?
Because they indicate active fibroblast signaling, they tell us that the structural scaffolding of the heart is under severe stress and that the biological pathways leading to scar tissue formation are being actively triggered by the mechanical stretch.
Okay, let's frame this clinically for a second. You've got an ultra runner who finishes a grueling mountain race. A few hours later, they're feeling some severe chest tightness, maybe some shortness of breath, and they end up in the emergency department.
This is a scenario known in the field as the emergency department dilemma.
Because if an ER physician, who perhaps doesn't know the patient just ran 100 miles, draws a cardiac panel, they're going to see a biomarker profile that is terrifying.
They will see sky-high troponin, massively elevated NT-proBNP, and soaring galectin-3. According to standard clinical guidelines, this patient is in the midst of a massive, potentially fatal myocardial infarction.
It looks exactly like a severe heart attack.
Exactly.
But they are not having a heart attack. There is no blockage in their arteries causing this.
No, the coronary arteries are fully patent. Blood is flowing just fine. This requires us to fundamentally differentiate the mechanism of the biomarker release.
How so?
In a classic myocardial infarction, a plaque ruptures, a clot forms, and blood flow is cut off. The heart muscle cells downstream are starved of oxygen, they undergo ischemic necrosis, they die, their cell membranes burst, and they dump all their troponin into the blood. Ischemic cell death is a primary driver.
But in our ultra runner,
The mechanism is entirely mechanical.
so if the cells aren't dying from lack of oxygen, how is the troponin actually getting out of the heart and into the blood?
It all comes down to the microscopic architecture of the heart tissue. The heart muscle cells, the myocytes, are connected to one another by structural proteins called desmosomes.
Desmosomes. Okay.
Think of them like cellular spot welds. They keep the tissue intact as it forcefully contracts and relaxes. But when an athlete exercises at extreme intensity for 15 hours, the sheer volume of blood being pumped causes profound, prolonged stretching of the heart chambers.
So they're getting stretched to the limit.
This mechanical overload is so severe that the desmosomes actually begin to lose their integrity. The myocytes literally start to slip past one another.
Oh, wow. The structural glue is failing under the tension.
As the cells stretch and slip, their outer membranes become transiently permeable. The myocyte doesn't necessarily die, but it is stretched so thin, and the membrane is so structurally compromised that the troponin molecules in the cytoplasm can simply leak out through the membrane and into the surrounding bloodstream.
Here's where it gets really interesting, and I love this visual. It's like a submarine diving way too deep. The hull hasn't been breached by a torpedo. There is no gaping hole in the metal, but the pressure from the surrounding water is so intense that the hull begins to warp and water starts weeping through the microscopic seams.
That's exactly it.
The submarine isn't destroyed, but the structural integrity is severely compromised. That water weeping through the seams is the troponin leaking into the runner's blood.
The submarine analogy perfectly captures the pathophysiology. The leakage is a direct consequence of operating beyond the safe design limits of the vessel. And the research confirms that this phenomenon is entirely dependent on the extreme duration and intensity of the exertion.
They actually studied the duration aspect, right?
Yes. A study published in the Journal of Laboratory and Precision Medicine sought to isolate this. They compared marathon runners to a control group of athletes who were only permitted to run for 1 hour.
And what did the 1 hour runners look like?
The 1 hour runners showed negligible, clinically insignificant increases in cardiac biomarkers. Their submarines were operating well within safe depths.
So no leaks.
No leaks. The transient membrane permeability and the massive troponin leak were exclusively observed in the athletes who pushed the duration into the extreme ranges. The duration is the primary catalyst for the structural weeping.
Fortunately, in the acute phase, the submarine doesn't sink. The literature notes that these biomarker levels typically normalize within 72 hours to a week.
Right. The myocyte membranes reseal, the troponin is cleared by the kidneys, and the acute stretching subsides.
But that brings us to the inevitable, much darker consequence. What happens when you force the heart to endure this submarine pressure, not just once, but repeatedly, training cycle after training cycle, for a decade?
That is the transition from acute reversible stress into the territory of chronic, irreversible pathological remodeling.
The sources outline how repetitive acute volume overload forces the heart to permanently alter its structure just to survive the recurring trauma. And it appears that the right ventricle and the right atrium are disproportionately bearing the brunt of this damage. Why is the right side of the heart so much more vulnerable than the left?
The vulnerability of the right heart is rooted in its fundamental anatomy and hemodynamics. The left ventricle is the primary engine of the cardiovascular system. It has to generate enough pressure to pump blood through the aorta and out to every capillary bed in the entire body.
Right from your head to your toes.
Exactly. Because it operates against high systemic vascular resistance, it naturally develops thick, highly muscular walls. The right ventricle, conversely, only has to pump deoxygenated blood right next door into the pulmonary circulation of the lungs.
It's a low-pressure circuit.
A very low-pressure circuit. As a result, the walls of the right ventricle and the right atrium are significantly thinner and much more compliant. Under normal resting conditions, this is highly efficient.
But during a race?
During an ultra-endurance event, the total cardiac output can increase 5-fold or more. The right ventricle is suddenly inundated with massive volumes of venous return that it must forcefully push into the pulmonary vasculature. Because its walls lack the thick muscular reinforcement of the left side, they stretch and distend much more dramatically under this acute volume overload.
And we can actually measure this fatigue, right? Mm-hmm. The sources mention that post-race imaging frequently shows a transient reduction in right ventricular ejection fraction.
Yes, echocardiography performed immediately after these extreme events frequently demonstrates that the right ventricle is essentially stunned.
Stunned?
Yes, its ejection fraction, the percentage of blood it successfully pumps out with each beat, measurably drops. It is fatigued, overstretched, and struggling to contract effectively.
If an athlete does that once a year, maybe it fully recovers. But the sources define chronic exposure as accumulating 200 to 300 MET hours per week of training over decades. When that stunned, overstretched state happens week in and week out, the transient stretching triggers a permanent fibrotic response. We start seeing actual scar tissue forming in the myocardium.
The development of patchy myocardial fibrosis is the hallmark of this chronic pathological remodeling. And the technology we use to identify this has honestly revolutionized sports cardiology. We utilize cardiac magnetic resonance imaging, or CMR.
How does the CMR actually differentiate between healthy, thick heart muscle and scar tissue?
It relies on a specialized contrast agent called gadolinium. During the MRI, gadolinium is injected into the bloodstream. In healthy, tightly packed myocardial tissue, the gadolinium washes in and washes out relatively quickly.
Okay, so it doesn't stick around.
Right. However, fibrotic scar tissue is composed of dense collagen, which creates an expanded extracellular space. The gadolinium seeps into this extracellular matrix and gets trapped there, washing out much more slowly.
So it effectively highlights the scars.
Exactly. When we image the heart several minutes after the injection, the areas of fibrosis appear bright white on the scan. This technique is called late gadolinium enhancement, or LGE.
And what researchers are finding on these CMR scans of veteran endurance athletes is a highly specific pattern of scarring. It does not look like the scar left behind by a traditional heart attack, does it?
No, it is morphologically distinct. A myocardial infarction typically leaves a dense, contiguous transmural scar, meaning it often spans the entire thickness of the heart wall localized to the specific territory supplied by the blocked artery.
A big, solid block of dead tissue.
Right. In contrast, the LGE pattern observed in these veteran athletes is typically subepicardial or mid-myocardial and very patchy.
Meaning it's located in the outer and middle layers of the heart wall, not the inner lining.
Yes, we see these small, scattered islands of scar tissue, primarily located at the hinge points where the right ventricle inserts into the interventricular septum.
Which perfectly corroborates the mechanical stress theory. The scars are forming precisely at the structural anchor points that are being violently pulled and stretched during those massive volume overloads. It's tearing at the seams.
That's exactly what's happening.
But what is the actual cellular mechanism driving this? How does mechanical stretching turn into hard collagen?
The translation of mechanical force into chemical scarring is mediated by the cardiac fibroblasts. These are the specialized cells responsible for maintaining the extracellular matrix, the supportive scaffolding of the heart.
Okay, so they're the builders.
Right. When the heart wall is subjected to extreme mechanical stretch, it triggers mechanosensors on the cell surface. This mechanical stress, combined with the neurohormonal cascade of extreme exercise, things like elevated catecholamines and angiotensin II, activates a specific intracellular communication route known as the TGF-beta SMAD signaling pathway.
Let's unpack that pathway because it seems to be the engine of the damage here. What does TGF-beta actually tell the cells to do?
Transforming growth factor beta is a potent cytokine. When the SMAD pathway is activated, it acts as a master switch, instructing the fibroblasts to proliferate and begin aggressively synthesizing and depositing structural proteins, specifically collagen types I and III, into the extracellular space.
It's literally calling in the construction crew to reinforce the walls that are buckling under pressure.
That's a great way to put it. Now, under moderate exercise conditions, this remodeling is a tightly controlled, highly regulated process. The heart utilizes a delicate balance of enzymes.
You keep it from overbuilding.
Exactly. On one side, you have matrix metalloproteinases, or MMPs, which are enzymes that break down and clear away old, damaged scaffolding. On the other side, you have tissue inhibitors of metalloproteinases, or TIMPs, which act as the brakes, preventing the MMPs from breaking down too much tissue.
It's a balance.
It is a constant, harmonious cycle of targeted demolition and targeted rebuilding that makes the athlete's heart slightly stiffer, stronger, and more efficient.
But when you introduce the chronic extreme stress of 300 mid-hours a week,
the harmonious balance is utterly obliterated. The relentless mechanical trauma, coupled with profound oxidative stress and systemic inflammation, throws the TGF-beta signaling into overdrive. The fibroblasts just deposit excessive amounts of collagen.
they just keep building.
And furthermore, this collagen undergoes excessive cross-linking, making it rigid and unyielding. The MMP and TIMP regulatory system completely fails to keep up with the deposition. The adaptive, healthy remodeling descends into unbridled pathological fibrosis.
The scaffolding becomes a rigid cage. And this scarring isn't just a mechanical problem. It fundamentally disrupts the electrical hardware of the heart.
It certainly does.
The sources provide a terrifying statistic regarding arrhythmias. Veteran endurance athletes exhibit a 5-fold increase in the prevalence of atrial fibrillation and atrial flutter compared to the general population.
A 5-fold elevation in risk is clinically staggering. Atrial fibrillation, or AFib, is an arrhythmia where the atria, the upper chambers, lose their coordinated electrical rhythm. Instead of contracting forcefully, they quiver chaotically.
And this electrical chaos is a direct consequence of the fibrotic remodeling.
Yes.
Because the electrical signal can't travel smoothly through scar tissue.
Precisely. Healthy myocardial tissue conducts electrical impulses seamlessly, but those scattered, patchy islands of collagen we saw in the CMR act as microscopic roadblocks. As the electrical wavefront attempts to travel through the atrium or the ventricle, it hits these fibrotic patches, fragments, and begins to loop back on itself, creating chaotic re-entry circuits. The scar tissue provides the physical substrate for the arrhythmia to take hold.
Wow. Okay, I have to ask the dog-old question here. The clinical reviews highlight that 22% of athletes presenting with this specific patchy fibrosis pattern went on to experience malignant, potentially life-threatening arrhythmias. For the listener who has dedicated their life to marathon training, the implication is terrifying.
It's very confronting data.
Is the act of running actually manufacturing heart disease in a healthy person? Or are we just unmasking pre-existing underlying genetic conditions that would have eventually surfaced anyway?
You have just articulated the most contentious debate in modern sports cardiology.
Oh, really?
Yes. One camp argues that these athletes likely harbor subtle genetic mutations, perhaps minor defects in desmosomal proteins that create a hidden vulnerability. In this view, the extreme exercise is merely a catalyst, accelerating a preordained pathology.
So they were going to have problems eventually, running just sped it up.
Right. However, an increasingly vocal consensus of researchers, supported by the data we are reviewing today, posits a much more alarming reality. The sheer magnitude of the mechanical trauma is the primary driver.
Meaning the running itself caused it.
They suggest that the relentless volume overload is fundamentally altering the architecture of a genetically normal heart, resulting in what is termed an acquired arrhythmogenic right ventricular cardiomyopathy. It is a cumulative injury over time, induced purely by the training load.
The idea that you can run your way into an acquired cardiomyopathy is sobering. But we have to move to the next layer of this paradox. We've established that the extreme mechanical load causes electrical misfires and scarring in the muscle wall. But what about the actual plumbing, the coronary arteries themselves?
Ah, yes, the plumbing.
There's a deeply ingrained cultural belief that endurance runners have absolutely pristine arteries.
This brings us to one of the most persistent and ultimately dangerous myths in sports medicine, the Basler hypothesis.
Let's delve into the history of that, because Dr. Thomas Basler made some massive claims in the 1970s. He essentially stated that the act of finishing a 42.2-kilometer marathon granted the runner lifelong absolute immunity to coronary atherosclerosis.
It's a very bold claim.
The prevailing wisdom was that if you were capable of running a marathon, it was physically impossible for you to die of a heart attack.
It was a very seductive hypothesis, largely because it aligned with our intuitive understanding of exercise. I mean, athletes are lean, they have low resting heart rates, exceptional lipid profiles, and high HDL cholesterol. It seemed logical that their arteries would be immaculately clean.
Right. It makes sense on paper.
Basler's theory heavily influenced an entire generation of runners and physicians. But as advanced imaging technologies emerged, the hypothesis was not just challenged, it was completely and unequivocally dismantled.
Which brings us to the Master at Heart study, published by the American College of Cardiology. This is a crucial piece of research. They designed a prospective observational study comparing 3 specific cohorts of men, all of whom had low traditional cardiovascular risk profiles. Can you break down the groups for us?
The study design was excellent. Group 1 consisted of lifelong master endurance athletes, men who had been training at high volumes continuously since their youth.
The lifers.
Exactly. Group 2 comprised late-onset athletes, individuals who adopted high-volume endurance sports after the age of 30, and Group 3 was the control. Healthy, fit, and active men who exercised moderately but did not participate in competitive endurance training.
To look inside the plumbing of these men, they didn't just use standard stress tests. They used computed tomography, angiography, or CCTA.
CCTA is a non-invasive imaging modality that utilizes high-resolution CT scanning combined with an intravenous contrast dye to visualize the exact anatomical structure of the coronary arteries. It allows us to see not just if there is a blockage, but the specific composition and location of the plaques within the arterial walls.
And the findings completely inverted the Bachelor hypothesis.
Completely.
When they compare the lifelong endurance athletes to the non-athletic controls, the lifelong athletes had an odds ratio of 1.86 for having one or more coronary plaques, meaning the elite runners were nearly twice as likely to have physical plaque buildup in their arteries compared to the men who just exercised moderately.
Yes. The prevalence of atherosclerosis was unequivocally higher in the high-volume athletes.
But the total plaque burden isn't even the most concerning part. The study revealed that lifelong athletes had an odds ratio of 2.80, almost 3 times as likely for having one or more non-calcified proximal plaques.
That specific metric, the massive increase in non-calcified proximal plaque, is the most clinically significant and alarming finding in the entire Master at Heart study.
Let's really break down the biology of plaque for the listener because the terminology matters here. The researchers also measured coronary artery calcium, or CAC scores. A CAC score of 0 is associated with a very low 2.1% risk of major adverse cardiac events, or MA, over a 10-year period.
Right.
Conversely, if your CAC score is over 400, your risk of a major event skyrockets to 34%. But a calcium score, by definition, only detects hard calcified plaque. It doesn't see the whole picture.
Exactly. To understand the danger, we have to look at the life cycle of an atherosclerotic plaque.
Okay, how does it start?
Plaque formation begins when LDL cholesterol particles penetrate the inner lining of the artery, the endothelium. These particles become oxidized, triggering an inflammatory response. Macrophages, a type of white blood cell, rush in to consume the cholesterol, eventually dying and becoming what we call foam cells.
Gross.
It is a bit gross. This accumulation creates a soft, lipid-rich core within the artery wall. This is a non-calcified plaque.
It's essentially a pocket of inflammatory fatty sludge inside the vessel wall.
That's an accurate description. Over time, the body recognizes this soft plaque as a structural vulnerability. In an attempt to heal and stabilize the lesion, the body initiates a process of calcification. It deposits calcium minerals into the plaque, literally turning it into a hard bone-like structure.
So it hardens it up to protect it.
Yes. While a heavily calcified plaque will narrow the lumen of the artery and restrict blood flow, it is structurally stable. The hard calcium shell prevents it from breaking open.
So the non-calcified plaque, the soft plaque that the lifelong runners have 3 times as much of, is the dangerous early-stage version.
It is the most lethal phenotype of plaque. Because it lacks that protective calcified shell, a soft plaque is highly friable and vulnerable to rupture. If the thin, fibrous cap overlying the lipid core tears, often triggered by a sudden spike in blood pressure or sheer mechanical stress, the highly thrombogenic contents of the plaque are instantly exposed to the flowing blood.
And the blood instantly clots to seal the rupture.
It forms an occlusive thrombus within seconds. The artery is completely blocked, blood flow ceases entirely, and the downstream heart muscle begins to die. That is the exact mechanism of a sudden, fatal myocardial infarction.
And the Master at Heart study demonstrated that these incredibly fit elite athletes have a significantly higher burden of these highly unstable lethal plaques, specifically in the proximal segments, the large main supply trunks of their coronary artery.
It's deeply concerning.
The data in the MDPI review mirrors this perfectly too. They found that male endurance athletes had a significantly higher overall prevalence of atherosclerotic plaques compared to sedentary males, 44.3% versus 22.2%. It is a total paradox. These athletes possess immaculate traditional lipid panels. They have negligible body fat. They eat optimized diets. Why on earth are their bodies aggressively building up so much dangerous plaque?
To solve the paradox, we must look beyond biochemistry and focus on hemodynamics. The prevailing pathophysiological theory centers on mechanical shear stress.
Shear stress.
Yes. When you are sedentary or exercising moderately, blood flows smoothly in a laminar fashion through the coronary arteries. But when an athlete exercises at extreme intensity for hours on end, their heart rate often exceeds 150 beats per minute and their systolic blood pressure surges dramatically.
The velocity of the blood being pumped through those small arteries just increases exponentially.
It becomes turbulent and highly pressurized. It's like water flowing through a canyon. Even if the water is crystal clear, representing perfect diet, low triglycerides, and extremely low LDL cholesterol, if that water is constantly rushing at the force and velocity of a fire hose, the sheer mechanical friction is going to eventually erode the rock wall.
The fire hose is physically stripping away the delicate inner lining, the endothelium of the coronary artery.
Yes. The chronic high shear stress induces microscopic trauma to the endothelial cells, and endothelial injury is the absolute prerequisite for plaque formation. Whenever the endothelium is damaged, the body's immune system mounts a localized inflammatory response to initiate repairs.
But because the athlete is training relentlessly, day after day, that inflammatory response never gets a chance to resolve.
The inflammation becomes chronic. The athlete is subjected to massive spikes in systemic inflammation post-workout, overlapping with constant mechanical endothelial damage.
So it's just a perpetual state of damage and repair.
This hyperinflammatory high-stress environment creates a scenario where any circulating cholesterol, even if the total levels are incredibly low, is rapidly oxidized and driven deep into the arterial wall to patch the damage. The process is so accelerated by the constant mechanical trauma that the body never has the time to properly calcify and stabilize these lesions. It just keeps packing in soft inflammatory lipid cores, resulting in the high prevalence of non-calcified plaque.
The fire hose is eroding the canyon walls, and the body is desperately, frantically trying to patch the cracks with soft mud because it never has the downtime to mix the concrete.
That's a phenomenal way to visualize it.
It's a mechanical destruction of the plumbing. And knowing that the arteries are structurally compromised by shear stress and the ventricular tissue is scarred from volume overload, we have to explore the final hidden vulnerability discussed in our sources, the immune system.
The interaction between extreme endurance exercise and immunology is a critical, often overlooked piece of the puzzle. We have this cultural perception that elite athletes possess invincible immune systems, that they are robust and impervious to illness.
But the physiological reality is that prolonged extreme exertion induces a profound state of transient immunosuppression. The literature refers to this phenomenon as the open window.
The open window hypothesis describes the period of altered immunity following heavy exertion, which can last from a few hours up to several days. During this window, both arms of the immune system are significantly depressed.
How depressed are we talking?
On the cellular immunity side, we see a marked decrease in the concentration and functional activity of natural killer cells, neutrophils, and macrophages, the primary white blood cells responsible for identifying and destroying pathogens.
So the cellular soldiers are essentially exhausted and incapacitated. And the sources note that humoral immunity is suppressed as well, particularly regarding immunoglobulin A.
Secretory immunoglobulin A, or IgA, is the frontline defender of the mucosal immune system. It lines the respiratory tract and the gastrointestinal tract, acting as a physical barrier to prevent viruses and bacteria from attaching to the epithelial cells and entering the bloodstream. Following an ultra-endurance event, salivary IgA production plummets.
The protective coating in the nose, throat, and gut is just washed away,
leaving the athlete highly susceptible to opportunistic infections. This is exactly why upper respiratory tract infections and gastrointestinal illnesses are incredibly common in the days following a major marathon or ultra event.
Sure, people get sick after a race all the time.
In a normal context, catching a post-race head cold is merely an inconvenience, but the clinical danger escalates exponentially when that opportunistic pathogen targets the myocardium.
Which brings us to myocarditis, inflammation of the heart muscle. The research emphasizes that athletes are uniquely exposed to specific pathogens due to the nature of their sport. For example, athletes engaged in trail running, mountain biking, or orienteering through dense brush are at a significantly higher risk of contracting Borrelia burgdorferi via tick bites, which is the bacterium responsible for Lyme disease.
Lyme carditis is a very real threat in those populations.
Furthermore, the crowded environments of race starting corrals, aid stations, and post-race medical tents are perfect vectors for the rapid transmission of viral agents like Coxsackie virus or adenovirus.
This creates a deeply challenging diagnostic scenario for sports cardiologists. We must differentiate between physiological inflammation and infectious pathology.
How do you tell the difference?
As we discussed earlier, after an ultramarathon, it is entirely expected for an athlete to exhibit high levels of systemic inflammation. We measure this using high sensitivity C-reactive protein, or HSCRP. A normal baseline might be under 1 milligram per liter, but post-race, it might temporarily surge to 29 or 30. That is a sterile inflammatory response to skeletal muscle damage, and it will subside.
But if an athlete contracts a virus during that open window of immunosuppression, the virus can bypass the depleted defenses, enter the bloodstream, and directly infiltrate the heart muscle, leading to infectious inflammatory cardiomyopathy.
And this is where the intersection of infection and extreme exercise becomes potentially lethal. If you have an active viral infection localized in the myocardium, the localized inflammatory response causes the myocytes to become swollen, fragile, and electrically unstable.
Okay, let me make sure I'm fully grasping the severity of this. Are we saying that an athlete could contract a relatively mild respiratory virus or a minor gastrointestinal bug, something they might barely notice, or just attribute to race day nerves, decide to push through it and run a 50-mile race, and by doing so, inadvertently cause severe, irreversible structural damage to their heart?
Tragically, yes. That is exactly what happens. If you overlap an active viral infiltration with the extreme mechanical wall stress, the massive volume overload, and the surging catecholamines of a 50-mile race, you orchestrate a perfect storm for myocardial necrosis.
Myocardial necrosis.
Cell death.
The sheer mechanical force of the heart pumping at 160 beats per minute physically rips the swollen, inflamed myocytes apart. The cells undergo necrosis, they die, and they are replaced by dense fibrotic scar tissue.
Oh my God.
What would have been a mild, self-resolving 3-day viral illness in a sedentary individual resting on the couch can precipitate a massive arrhythmic event or culminate in chronic heart failure in a competing athlete. You are literally tearing infected heart cells to pieces by forcing them to operate at maximum capacity while under viral attack. It is a terrifying biological reality. So, compiling all of this data, we're looking at a population subjected to extreme mechanical shear stress, eroding their coronary arteries, profound volume overload tearing the desmosomes and scarring their right ventricles, and severe immune suppression exposing them to necrotic myocarditis.
It's a lot when you put it all together.
How do sports cardiologists synthesize this? How do they advise these athletes to train? They obviously don't just hand them the U-shaped mortality curve and tell them to quit running forever.
No, and that is a vital point to emphasize. The ultimate objective of sports cardiology is never the blanket prohibition of exercise.
Right.
Even with all the pathologies we have discussed, epidemiological data consistently shows that elite athletes, in the aggregate, maintain longer overall life expectancies than the general sedentary population. The goal of the specialty is not to stop movement. It is personalized risk stratification and targeted intervention.
It is about identifying the athletes who are crossing the threshold from adaptation into pathology and protecting those intermediate risk runners before they become a tragic statistic.
Exactly. The clinical management strategies are highly individualized based on advanced imaging. For an athlete identified via CMR as having a significant burden of myocardial fibrosis, or who presents with alarmingly high CAC scores and non-calcified plaques on a CCTA, the first line of management is often exercise restriction.
Just telling them to slow down.
We prescribe a drastic reduction in both the intensity and the cumulative volume of their training to relieve the mechanical stress. For athletes who have already developed complex malignant arrhythmias secondary to that fibrosis and who are at a high imminent risk of sudden cardiac death, we may need to surgically implant an implantable cardioverter defibrillator, an ICD, to shock the heart out of a fatal rhythm.
And for the athletes suffering from the viral overlap.
For patients diagnosed with chronic inflammatory cardiomyopathy that remains active even after the initial virus has been cleared, where the immune system is continuously attacking the heart tissue, we often have to employ aggressive immunosuppressive therapies. We use powerful corticosteroids like prednisone or steroid-sparing agents like azathioprine to artificially suppress the immune response and halt the progressive destruction of the myocardium.
But what about the healthy listener? The ultrarunner who is currently asymptomatic, who loves the sport, but wants to proactively protect their heart from the fibrosis and the soft plaque buildup. The sources outline a very specific set of evidence-based training guidelines that fundamentally challenge the traditional endurance ethos of more mileage is always better.
Implementing these guidelines requires a profound paradigm shift in how enduring athletes conceptualize training. It moves the focus from accumulating massive volume to optimizing the physiological stimulus while strictly minimizing mechanical wear and tear.
Guideline number 1 from the clinical reviews is perhaps the hardest for an ultra runner to accept. Limit continuous, highly strenuous endurance training to a maximum of 1 hour per session, and keep the cumulative weekly volume of highly strenuous work under 7 hours.
To a marathoner who routinely goes out for 3-hour Sunday long runs, that limitation sounds like a detraining protocol.
Right. They hear 1 hour max and think they will lose all their aerobic capacity. But the guideline specifies the limit is for continuous, highly strenuous work, which leads directly into guideline number 2. The strategy for maintaining elite cardiovascular fitness without subjecting the heart to the chronic volume overload. The protocol recommends utilizing high-intensity interval training, or HID, 1 to 2 times weekly.
HIIT is an incredibly potent and efficient physiological tool. By executing short, near-maximal efforts followed by periods of recovery, you can effectively push your VO2 peak, enhance mitochondrial density, and improve lactate clearance.
You get all the benefits.
You acquire all the central and peripheral cardiovascular adaptations necessary for elite performance, but because the intervals are brief, you do not subject the ventricular chambers to the relentless, hours-long mechanical stretching that causes the desmosomes to fail and the TGF-beta signaling to initiate fibrosis. You extract the fitness adaptation while circumventing the structural damage.
It's exactly like managing a high-performance business. You cannot operate a company in crisis mode 24/7. You can't demand your employees work 100-hour weeks indefinitely. Initially, productivity might spike, but eventually the system breaks down. Employees burn out, critical errors are made, and the underlying structure of the company collapses.
It's unsustainable.
You need intense, highly focused sprints, the equivalent of HIIT, to achieve rapid, sharp gains in market share or product development. But those sprints must be immediately followed by scheduled downtime. You have to let the system recover. And that concept of scheduled downtime translates perfectly to guideline number 3, incorporating cardiac rest periods.
The cardiac rest period is a crucial, heavily evidence-based intervention. It involves deliberately programming brief, intermittent walking breaks into the middle of any long endurance run.
You are literally forcing the biological machinery to cool off so the engine doesn't overheat and melt the gaskets. By transitioning from a run to a walk for just 3 to 5 minutes, the physiological shift is profound. The skeletal muscle demand for oxygen plummets, causing the heart rate to fall rapidly. The systolic blood pressure drops, which reduces the afterload, the resistance the heart has to pump against.
And most importantly, the venous return decreases,
which immediately relieves the volume overload and physical stretch on the thin walls of the right ventricle, allowing the tissue to return toward its resting baseline. You are intentionally breaking the chain of continuous mechanical strain.
It provides the myocardium with a vital window to temporarily reset its hemodynamics and clear metabolic byproducts before the stress resumes. The final pillar of these protective guidelines involves meticulous hydration management.
Hydration.
The recommendation is to consume 400 to 800 milliliters of fluid per hour, strictly drinking to thirst, rather than adhering to an arbitrary schedule.
And the sources emphasize boundaries on both ends of the hydration spectrum. You have to cap the total fluid intake.
The guidelines explicitly advise avoiding overhydration, capping intake at roughly 3 liters during an event. The primary danger of excessive fluid consumption is exercise-associated hyponatremia, a potentially fatal condition where the sodium concentration in the blood becomes dangerously diluted.
But there's a mechanical side to this too, right?
Exactly. From a mechanical cardiac perspective, overhydration artificially expands the blood plasma volume, dramatically exacerbating the volume overload and further stretching the right ventricle.
Wow, so you're just adding more pressure to the submarine.
You're filling it with more fluid. Conversely, the guidelines dictate keeping total body mass loss under 2% to prevent severe dehydration. If an athlete becomes profoundly dehydrated, their blood volume drops, the blood becomes highly viscous, and the heart has to pump significantly harder at a much higher heart rate to deliver the same amount of oxygen, drastically increasing the ischemic and mechanical stress on the myocardium.
Proper hydration is a delicate balance of protecting the blood volume without flooding the chambers.
Precisely.
So bringing all of this incredible, dense science back to you, the listener, we have gone on an extraordinary journey through the inner workings of the human heart today. We examined the sheer acute trauma of extreme events, the desmosomes stretching to their breaking point, the submarine weeping troponin into the bloodstream under immense pressure.
We covered a lot of ground.
We analyzed the long-term consequences of that pressure. The right ventricular fatigue, the insidious development of patchy fibrosis driven by TGF-beta signaling, and the very real danger of chaotic arrhythmias. We uncovered the stunning paradox of athletic atherosclerosis, detailing how the fire hose of turbulent blood flow damages the endothelium, leading to the rapid accumulation of soft, highly vulnerable plaques in the fittest humans alive.
And the immune system.
Right. We explored the open window of immune suppression and the catastrophic risk of overlapping a viral infection with maximum exertion. And finally, we detailed the clinical protocols for protecting the engine, utilizing HII for fitness, incorporating cardiac rest periods to relieve chamber tension, and strictly managing hydration to optimize blood volume.
The overarching takeaway from the literature is that exercise is undeniably a powerful and necessary medicine. But the fundamental law of pharmacology applies here just as it does anywhere else. The dose determines the poison.
The dose determines the poison.
The objective should be optimizing your lifelong cardiovascular health and longevity, not blindly pushing your physical limits until the biological system structurally fails.
As we wrap up this deep dive into the sources, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over during your next run. Think about the grand timeline of human evolution. For millions of years, our ancestors survived through very specific patterns of movement. We evolved to sprint intensely to catch prey or to escape a predator, followed by prolonged periods of complete rest and recovery.
That's our biological heritage.
Our biology was forged in the fires of intense, brief exertion. We did not evolve to run continuously at maximum cardiovascular capacity for 15 hours straight across a mountain range. Are modern ultra-endurance sports pushing us into a profound evolutionary mismatch? Have we finally reached a point in our development where our immense psychological willpower has simply outpaced the structural realities of our ancient biology?
It is a sobering and profound question. When we look at the fibrosis and the plaques, the data strongly suggests we may be demanding our hearts perform a task they were fundamentally never designed to execute.
And when you push a machine past its evolutionary design limits, the diagnostic waters get very, very murky. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating, paradoxical science of the extreme athlete's heart. Keep moving, stay curious, and above all, remember to listen to your engine.